Our Lord does not care for beauty. Bhaal cares only for death. Death in numbers. Death in droves.
There's a dense, foggy space that blurs the line between horror and fantasy. I've never known why it appeals to me, but as soon as I was exposed to it, it became my happy place. My favorite flavor of fictional reality. I've always secretly wished that one of these somewhat coextensive lands between was instead my material reality. I kinda want to live in a world that, while whimsical in many aspects during the daylight hours, harbors darkness beyond imagination in its more secret, forgotten places. A life overflowing with opportunities to become a hero, or a villain, where even the scum of society could, potentially, float to the top and find their way into the swollen tomes of history, jealously guarded by scholars sequestered in magnificent libraries. Places themselves replete with secret plots and niches, where forgotten volumes instructing the darker truths of the world are hidden away until they can worm their way out of the shadows and work their terrible magic on the world once again. I love and have always loved the rich subgenre usually referred to as fantasy horror. My first exposure to it came in the form of movies. Stuff like Labyrinth, which used to really scare me as a child for some strange reason, as well as Neverending Story, The Dark Crystal, and the old Ralph Bakshi version of The Hobbit, all of which have many scenes of often outright horror. The first PC games that I remember playing were Doom, and an ancient dungeon crawler called The Eye of the Beholder, which, along with playing into my already firmly established love for fantasy horror, kicked off my lifelong love of both CRPGs and D&D in general. I played all the old dungeon crawlers I could find. Might and Magic, Wizardry, The Bard's Tale, Dragon Wars. At one point I got 2 of the gold box game collections and played all the old D&D games from before my time. Everything from Azure Bonds to Menzober Anzan, and even the Ravenloft series. I was also really into the Ultima games for a while, with Ultima Online being my first MMO, as well as the first in a long procession of unhealthy obsessions. Seriously, it was bad. Back then, I'd play that game every single hour of every day if I could get away with it. If you know what the title Dreadlord refers to, you're my people. Drop a comment. Of course, amongst this ever-expanding list were the first 2 Baldur's Gate games. These immediately became some of my favorites. I finished the first game, but never got completely through the second. I've done multiple partial playthroughs of each, getting the itch and making a new character once in a while. I played Planescape Torment a few years later. I actually did beat that and was introduced to the concept of the Planescape of D&D, which made me realize how much more there was to this fictional universe. So much that I'd never learn enough about it just playing the D&D video games. This was where my interest escaped the screen, and I started learning more about D&D in general. I read the Drizzt books and went online, absorbing every bit of lore I could dig up. Eventually, this interest spread to other tabletop game worlds, beginning with Vampire the Masquerade, which takes place in the World of Darkness setting, and currently taking the form of budding obsessions with Warhammer 40k and Pathfinder. I've never even played the tabletop versions of most of these. I'm still completely obsessed with the lore, though. So of course I was waiting for Baldur's Gate 3 to be released with open anticipation, telling my largely disinterested friends about how excited I was to play it, and how long I'd been waiting for it to drop. This was one time the hype was real! And it turned out to be everything I'd hoped it was, with a few quibbles here and there. One playthrough in particular firmly straddles the fantasy horror aspects of the Forgotten Realms. That is, of course, the Dark Urge. In order to understand what I see in the Dark Urge playthrough, you have to understand how I see the multiverse that is D&D. You know my history with the setting, so now I want to show you a few of the exquisite horrors I see when I think of the often deeply unsettling planescape encompassing Dungeons & Dragons. If you stop and think about it for any amount of time, you start to see how deranged the setting truly is. This is a place where it's really quite common for kobolds, or goblins, or any of a huge number of monstrous things to ransack entire towns. putting the buildings to flame and dragging off the citizenry to meet unspeakable fates in cavernous dens deep beneath the surface. A place where what appears to be an innocent old woman sometimes ends up being a cruel, monstrous hag, bent on wrecking your life. Where the sibling that was taken in the night returns in undead form a week later, at the behest of their new master, in order to lure you into the same fate that befell them. Where cave systems kilometers beneath the surface house multiple hostile civilizations, along with a host of general subterranean monstrosities. One such society worships a vindictive spider goddess, bent on subjugating the world above and dominating everyone not of their species. This is a state of affairs overseen by an entire pantheon of gods and godlike beings, vying for control of the cosmos in eternal games that use their believers as both pawns and fuel sources. A cosmos created by Lovecraftian elder god-style beings, who more or less dreamt it into existence. A multiverse that used to, and one day will again, be ruled by squid-headed, hive-minded abominations that reproduce by implanting a tadpole into the eye of other beings, watching as they slowly, painfully turn into monsters. Even before reaching the waiting, fear-blinkered eyeball, these tadpoles themselves have been subjected to a poison jar situation, where they had to fight off and kill hundreds or thousands of their siblings in a pool of brine, until only the strongest survivors remain to enter the second stage of their life cycle. These brine pools can also house the elder brain leaders of mind flayer colonies, who prey on the tadpoles as well, using them as a macabre protein supplement. I could go on listing examples for hours, so 2 more. In this multiverse, people who spend their lives spreading evil are, in the afterlife, reincarnated into vile little grubs that again have to fight off swarms of other larvae until only the strongest remain. A fetid crop that usually become either low-level devils or demons, or are swiped by night hags and become, at least for a time, currency. Anyone, anywhere could walk through the wrong door or the wrong stretch of misty forest and find themselves in an entirely different alien part of the plains. Whether Sigil, the impossible city of doors, or a domain of dread like Ravenloft, these unfortunates are usually lost to time and space forever, and forced to wander whatever fresh hell they've discovered until they meet any number of horrific fates. Unless they land in Sigil, then they can kind of become just another citizen of a city filled with people who got lost somewhere along the way, just drowning their sorrows in the Burning Man and trying to avoid the omnipresent gaze of the Lady of Pain. Just don't interact with the recruiters for the Blood War, or you'll find yourself the victim of one of those horrific fates I was just talking about. There is no glory, some glory, to be found in the eternal, meaningless battles of the Blood War. This is where most of those evil little grubs end up, fodder for an infinite war raging impotently between the devils and demons that populate the 9 hells and the abyss, respectively. There's so much evil and horror in D&D that devils and demons are split into 2 very distinct categories of creature. Here there isn't just evil, but different, often competing philosophies of evil. An idea that's even reflected in the very different ways one can choose to operate as the Dark Urge. The devils of the 9 hells favor order and hierarchy, sometimes even demonstrating a sense of duty or responsibility, especially where making good on pacts or promises is concerned. The demons of the abyss, however, favor only chaos and mindless destruction, pain and pleasure. If we narrow our scope to the Sword Coast, the specific geographic region of the Forgotten Realms that the Baldur's Gate series takes place in, you can see how all the elements I've listed above condense down and affect every stream, every mountain, every being and story within its borders. Nothing is exactly as it seems on the surface, and everything is coated in the still, drying blood of dark histories. Lying on the western shore of Faerun, bordering the violent Sea of Swords, this land is by far the most prolific setting in D&D. Its past fraught with historic, often bloody events that affect not only the world, but every plane of the D&D universe. It stretches from arguably Icewind Dale in the north to Alm in the south, and extends east into a deadly, mostly untamed wilderness, hiding multitudes of those dark and secret little corners I've come to love so well. Because it's such a popular location for adventurers, a consistent flow of notable events have created a rich tapestry of history that's well beyond the scope of this video. We're going to focus on the city of Baldur's Gate itself, as well as the history of Bhaal, the god of murder, who's kind of a huge deal in the Dark Urge playthrough. Baldur's Gate originated as a pirate hideout, situated in the mouth of the river Cheonthar. It made an obvious location for a port, and over the years it became a colony, then town, then city, but maintained some of its swashbuckling flavor into modern times, the Blushing Mermaid Tavern being a prime example. A seafaring adventurer named Baldur crossed the western seas and returned with invaluable treasures, a large amount of which he gifted to the colony, which they used to build walls, and the iconic Baldur's Gate, which eventually ended up separating the impoverished lower city from the social elite of the upper city, as well as becoming its namesake. Baldur departed on a second voyage soon after and never returned, his ultimate fate still a mystery. The city's population is large, but kinda tiny compared to other cities in the region, like Waterdeep, a considerable distance to the north. Most of the population lives outside of the walls due to the city's lack of space and general cost of living. Baldur's Gate is overpopulated and, despite a considerable amount of verticality, has never been able to overcome this limitation. The streets are so tiny and conditions so cramped that horses and even dogs aren't allowed within its walls. There's quite a bit of crime, and criminal organizations basically supplant local government in certain areas of the lower city. But conditions usually remain peaceful due to the presence of a mercenary group called the Flaming Fist. There have been a number of scandals and even uprisings in the city's history, the most notable of which revolve around the existence of Bhaalspawn. These are the mortal children of a, let's say, once and future god, known as Bhaal, the Lord of Murder. Also heavily involved is the Church of Bhaal, operating out of a handful of temples, one of which is hidden in the sewers beneath Baldur's Gate. These dark churches house a sinister cult of assassins and psychopaths, dedicated to empowering their god through the act of ritualistic murder. In the first two Baldur's Gate games, you learn about and often actively participate in the history of the Bhaalspawn. I'm not going to give a complete synopsis of these games, I'm trying to keep this video under the 5-hour mark, but in order to understand the Dark Urge, you need to understand a little bit of the history involved. Also, it's pretty interesting. Bhaal used to be a mortal man like any other. He was a part of an adventuring group known as the Dead Three. This group consisted of Merkel, a powerful necromancer, Bane, a domineering man with a shrouded past, as well as the assassin, Bhaal. These three made a pact with each other to become gods, and after a long series of adventures, arrived in a realm called the Grey Wastes, where the old god of death, Jurgal, reigned in his castle of bone. Rather than the epic fight you might expect, Jurgal just kinda agreed to relinquish his godhood to the three, claiming he'd grown tired of it. As you might expect from an evil group of adventurers reaching the end of their journey, goal in sight, they immediately set into a bickering and a fighting, unable to amicably agree on who would inherit Jurgal's powers. Jurgal, growing impatient with these tantruming children, recommended they decide via competition. The competition he recommended was called skull bowling. I'm not kidding. The goal was to roll the skulls of some of Jurgal's liches across the plain of the Grey Waste. Whoever chucked their cranium the furthest would win. Weirdly, the god of beasts, Malar, popped up like an inconvenient boner and insisted on being able to play too. This story gets no less insane going forward. I guess everyone was annoyed that Malar just kinda showed up trying to nose in, wanting a piece of the action, and the last thing this competition, or story, needed was some random pick-me god trying to scoop up a bit of extra power. So Jurgal then recommended they decide via a game of chance. What game of chance, you may ask? Something called Knucklebones. Pretty much just a more morbid version of dice. Using his own literal knucklebones as the game pieces, Jurgal cut Malar out of the competition, so he left like the unpopular, unpicked kid in a schoolyard baseball game. Bane won the first round and asked to become the god of tyranny. Merkel won the second and chose death as his domain. Our boy Bhaal, somewhat spitefully, claimed the act of murder as his own lot, stating that he was the true winner because he could weaken Bane by killing his subjects, or choke Merkel's domain by staying his hand. So the three rose to godhood and went separate ways, each absconding to their own realm to plot against the other two and pretty much everyone in general. This state of affairs wouldn't last forever, though, as an extremely consequential period known as the Time of Troubles was about to change the dynamics of divinity. After pissing off the overgod Ao right and proper by stealing some tablets from him, as well as being generally bad at the whole keeping the balance thing, what with all the constantly vying for more power, Ao condemned the gods of Toril to walk the lands as mortal avatars. Foreseeing his own demise, Bhaal put a plan into motion that would secure his divine power in the form of, well, an abundance of mortal children that would become known as Bhaalspawn. So, yeah, Bhaal spent the Time of Trouble sowing his wild oats with pretty much any female member of any sentient race. These women came in many, many forms. Dude knocked up a fire giant, as well as, and I kid you not, an actual blue dragon. I wouldn't spend too much time trying to imagine the logistics of such an act, let alone whatever game he had to run to get this dragoness to agree to do the deed. But yeah, he managed to impregnate her. I know dragons can generally adopt human forms, but it's more fun for me to picture Bhaal up on a ladder or something with 70s funk music playing in the background. You know what? Never mind. Let's not go there. He fathered just a ton of these kids, with everything from the aforementioned giant and dragon to drow and half-orcs and elves. Bhaal clearly doesn't discriminate, which is actually a kinda rare positive where he's concerned. Most don't exactly think progressive social values when considering the god of murder, but there we are. Anyway, he managed to successfully pepper the lands with his doomed progeny before his prophesied death at the hands of Cyric, the god of lies, who subsequently took Bhaal's portfolio and realm for himself. This led to a split between the now two factions of the Church of Ritual Murder Lovers, most turning to Cyric with some scattered sects remaining loyal to Bhaal, confident that he would eventually re-emerge and retake his station. This is where the events of the first two Baldur's Gate games come into play. Canonically, the name of the main character you play is Abdel Adrian. Abdel was a Bhaalspawn that was hidden away in a grand library on the Sword Coast named Candlekeep by a scholar named Gorion. He didn't know anything about his heritage, and unlike the rest of his kin, seemed to be largely devoid of homicidal tendencies for most of his youth, likely a result of his upbringing as the ward of Gorion. Eventually, the other Bhaalspawn, quite like the tadpoles and demon grubs we've covered, decided it was time to Highlander up and kill each other until only one remained. This lone survivor would claim the slivers of divine power secured in each of their half-siblings, and essentially become the new Bhaal, thus reclaiming his station as the god of murder. There can be only one, and all that good stuff. D&D really likes the whole Highlander scenario. I found multiple instances of it during my research. Anyway, this led to Abdel being hunted by the other Bhaalspawn, initially one named Sarevok Anchev. Sarevok had concocted a scheme to take over Baldur's Gate, and use the power he gained to hunt down and kill the other Bhaalspawn. Getting wind of these plans, Abdel's adopted parent Gorion tried to get him out of Candlekeep and into hiding, but it was too late. Ambushed by Sarevok while fleeing Candlekeep, Gorion died to give Abdel enough time to escape. He was joined by his friend, the thief Imoen, and they began the adventure that comprises Baldur's Gate 1. Eventually, they were able to kill Sarevok and expose his schemes, but he was only the beginning of their problems. Here's where I could go into a really long story about the second game and the expansion Throne of Bhaal, but you should really just go play it yourself. It's widely considered to be one of the best role-playing games ever made. Long story short, Abdel became caught up in a series of events known as the Bhaalspawn Crisis, where 5 of the spawn amassed armies and decided to start hunting and killing their half-siblings. There were betrayals, intrigue, and a lot of dead Bhaalspawn. But eventually, Abdel came out on top, and instead of ascending to godhood with the divine energy he'd amassed during the conflict, he decided to give it up, have it hidden away, and instead became the Grand Duke of Baldur's Gate. Well, at least that's the canon ending. You could decide to become the new Bhaal in the game if you were so inclined. All would not end well for Abdel, however, and this is where the canon gets a bit wonky in my eyes. Turns out there was one remaining Bhaalspawn, named Vikang, who attacked Abdel during a speech he was giving in front of a throng of citizens. So, How was he given the choice to ascend when there was actually still another ball spawn left? First rule of Highlandering: there can be only one. Anyway, they fought and it's unknown which one of them died, but the victor promptly transformed into one of the three forms Bhaal was known to take out in public, the Slayer. This Slayer proceeded to, well, slay a whole lot of the amassed citizens. At some point, Bhaal created a different kind of ball spawn, one that was crafted from his own flesh, and this is where the Dark Urge comes in. Also, I guess the kids of ball spawn are somehow also considered ball spawn now, despite not having a sliver of Bhaal's divinity, which I'm hoping someone can explain to me, but that's not important quite yet. Before continuing, there are a few things I feel are worth mentioning about the Church of Bhaal, as they play heavily into the plot of Baldur's Gate 3, regardless of whether or not you're playing as the Dark Urge. Separated into rural and urban chapters, these cultists were about what you would expect from worshippers of the god of murder. Many of them were evil clerics and skilled assassins. They had murder quotas and would make money by claiming that a daily tithe to the church would prevent you from ending up on the business end of a ceremonial dagger. Hey, maybe that'll work with subscriptions too. Hit the subscribe button and the assassins that perpetually haunt your thoughts will give you a single day's respite. Please. They have a holiday called the Feast of the Moon, where members would gather to gossip like spinsters about whatever neat murders they'd performed over the past year, as well as regale each other with famous slayings, usually including the killing of a king by an assassin known as Untitled the Blood-Drenched? Untitled the Blood-Drenched, whom I will hereafter be referring to as Uthid, because I can't be bothered to pronounce that name 10 more times. This assassination is primarily what I wanted to cover about the church, as it's a prime example of some of the crazy stuff Ballists get up to, and an absolutely insane story in its own right. Our main man, Uthid, was an extremely skilled spellcaster, having mastered both the arcane and divine arts. He was so good that he was even able to create his own spells. One of these was called the Destroying Fist, which is described as having a localized disintegration effect. Uthid is most famous for the murder of one king, Samite of Tether? Yeah, who absolutely knew Uthid was coming for that ass. The king poured all the resources he could muster into protecting himself. This included a guard riding a Pegasus, a horde of normal guards, court wizards, and a black dragon. I'm just gonna read what happened straight from the wiki because, damn. The following is a quote from Uthid's entry. The epic account began in Castle Desage, where Uthid teleported right in front of the flying Pegasus riding guard above the king's chambers. He quickly dispatched the guard and took control of the Pegasus. He steered the mount towards the skylight, smashed it, and plunged the creature to its death while saving his own hide. As this happened, the guards released arrows, but the assassin mage priest leapt away, causing the arrows to strike the Pegasus. Uthid then flew towards a guardian black dragon, instantly slaying it with his destroying fist. After the dragon fell, the mage priest rode upon the beast's acid breath as his own armor dissolved. Without the dragon as a target, the assassin turned his attention to the guards and their weapons. He cast a spell to cause in-flight arrows and even those still in their quivers to turn into a swarming group. The Blood-Drenched focused next on the king himself, with just a dagger in hand. Though guards poured towards the assassin, he slew them all, one by one, and cut the monarch in 100 places. Afterward, he cast a spell to force the king to maniacally dance to his death, his blood draining from his cuts with every move. Once the king was slain, Uthid cast a pair of trapping spells and teleported to safety. Afterward, the entrapping spells activating a meteor swarm that killed 4 court wizards, followed by a special blade barrier that slew every blood relative of the king who entered the throne room. 2 of King Samite's sons walked into the room and were killed by the divine barrier of blades. End quote. So, yeah. Dude killed a black dragon by punching it to death with a localized disintegrate effect, and the king himself with something akin to Otto's Irresistible Dance, probably my favorite D&D spell, combined with the death of 1,000 cuts. Then killed the next 2 heirs with a magical trap after he'd already left. That's the story the church retells at the Feast of the Moon. D&D lore is pretty metal sometimes. This feels like the story behind a prog rock album cover. Together with what we're going to learn about Orin the Red, the head of the Temple of Bhaal in Baldur's Gate 3, this should give you some idea of the caliber of absolute mad lads the church has been known to produce. Just a not-so-humble religious order of ultra-skilled murderous psychopaths. Returning to the Bhaal spawn, most members of Bhaal's sacrificial brat squad are natural-born killers. Individuals bent on mayhem of the highest order, but not all of them. Canon Abdel was an exception, apparently because of his upbringing in Candlekeep, and his genuine, warm relationships with both Gorion and Imoen. Vikang, before finally going after Abdel Adrian, had a spontaneous teleportation power that would instantly translocate him away if he saw another Bhaal spawn. He spent his life running from fights, until the Highlander bug finally got to him once there were only 2 Bhaal spawn left. There was also this other dude, Balthazar, not that Balthazar, who was intending to kill the other Bhaal spawn, not to restore Bhaal to his proper throne, but instead so he could then kill himself and destroy Bhaal's accumulated essence. He was still totally trying to kill Abdel, as well as whatever composition of befuddled, possibly hamster-obsessed weirdos you've collected during your playthrough. But overall, the man wanted to stop Bhaal's attempt to be reborn. He's not quite at the same level of blood-crazed slaughter factory as so many of his half-siblings. They also varied in, let's say, ability to function in society and mix it up with the general population, without leaving a very wide and ostentatious sea of bodies in their wake. They often rose through guile, power, or both to the top of whatever civilization they were born into. Sarevok's plan was actually exposed during his coronation as the Grand Duke of Baldur's Gate. My point is, they seem to be greatly influenced by their lives and experiences, but have this little inborn seed of evil, a sliver of Bhaal, always there, always whispering to them in their own voice. But what if there was a Bhaal spawn that was a blank slate, with nothing but a wet crimson streak running through the middle? No memories of the past, not even a name, defined only by an endless, unnatural hunger for violence. A dark urge, a never-ending nag deep in their skull, with no context, no explanation. Also a mind flayer tadpole, that's also pretty deep in their skull. It's not a great start, but it's the one the urge gets. Can you imagine popping out of some tube on an interdimensional squid UFO, knowing you've got an alien tadpole with extremely sharp teeth lodged in your frontal lobe? Imagine that being your first memory. Oh, and it isn't sleeping. You can feel it in there, gently wriggling, making itself comfy at home. And additionally, an inexplicable compulsion to murder everything you see. Actually, considering the circumstances, I can kind of understand the desire to just butcher everything within view. But after a while, it does indeed become apparent that this urge isn't just murderous desires flooding your brain due to the shock of waking up in the octopus's garden with a new special friend aboard the good ship Grey Matter. It's not even a side effect caused directly by the tadpole itself as it fiddles around with your wiring. No, the urge isn't that lucky. This whole what would make me happiest in any given situation is to stab everyone thing is an entirely separate problem from the brainworm. The dark urge origin starts you out just as screwed as in any other playthrough. You've just also got this whole other thing going on. It's kinda like being embraced by a Malkavian. Once you escape from the Calamari cruiser... Okay, I'll stop. With or without squishing us, the intellect devourer, lovable scamp, and talking brain with legs, in that order, you're almost free to pick your own path. There are a ton of different ways to play the Dark Urge, but there are 3 immediately obvious paths. The first understandable inclination is to just murder hobo your way through the game, leaving bloody desolation everywhere you go. Villagers, companions, random wildlife, just go nuts right out the gate. The second is the more middle-of-the-road approach. You don't deny the urge, but nor do you constantly give into it. You choose your targets carefully and lie, threaten, or charm your way out of any consequences, if you attract unwanted attention. You maintain a functional relationship with at least some companions, and may even keep up a somewhat positive reputation with many groups or factions, usually where it suits your interests. This is basically the serial killer approach to being the Dark Urge. The third way is to fight the urge and almost never kill any innocents. Note I said almost, as at least one indulgence is completely out of your control. Which I kinda hate. If you go down this last path, you likely spend the rest of the game disgusted with yourself and resisting the urge at every future opportunity, remorseful and unwilling to stain your hands any further. I mostly stuck with the second option, going for it when I thought I could get away with it, but keeping my inclinations to myself, weaseling my way out of it if I screwed up. There were times I dabbled with the first path, but I at least publicly denied my nature when it was in my best interest to do so. I only really went nuts when my overall goals for the playthrough were reliant on it, as with the Last Light Inn and the things that you must do if you want to recruit Minthara. Though apparently that's changed since the last patch. Or if I could easily get away with it or even pass it off as a good deed. I was the hero who killed an entire compound of Grey Dwarfs, not a profoundly sick individual looking for any viable excuse to end as much life as possible without having to suffer any consequences. So my urge is unashamed of their nature, but smart enough to know when they can get away with it, reputation intact, or even improved. They can usually maintain the guise of sanity while secretly anticipating the next time the pieces of a situation fit well enough to risk indulging in their favorite, perfect drug. They're like a teenager waiting for their parents to leave the house for work so they can light up or steal drinks. Except instead of whatever swill your parents leave in the fridge, it's sending folks over cliffs with eldritch blasts. Waking up with total amnesia stripped away any pretense. She had no real reason not to indulge in the strange obsession. The only objective is, initially, to find someone who can remove the tadpole from her head. And that gives her, as well as her cranial stowaway, a lot of wiggle room. Yeah. For all she knows, she's always been like this, and taking lives has consistently been the center of her identity. It's the only bit of herself remaining after whoever had scrambled her brain. It's like that part came from something somewhere else. Some uncrackable alien archstone of personality and spirit. Her first times were confusing for her. She didn't fully understand why attacking one thing was okay, even considered a public service of sorts, while going after others would lead to shunning and fear. She had little understanding or use for conventional morality. Initially, taking down a goblin felt about the same as taking down a blacksmith. Both would temporarily satisfy her need, but one ended with her being labeled a monster slayer, while the other led to her being seen as a monster herself. She had lost most of her knowledge of how the world worked, but as with many sociopaths, she had a keen social awareness, and the judgment in the eyes of those who realized what she was told her all she needed to know. This eventually lent the act of harming those deemed innocent and therefore off limits an extra thrilling layer. Soon, smashing a goblin became less pleasurable to her than getting away with the ending of an innocent life. She was almost completely free to become the perfect, impersonal killer her very nature indicated she was. The only thing that really held her back were her companions. The new allies were undeniably useful, worth sparing the butchery as long as they were so very necessary. The ones without the stomach for the urge's modus operandi left early. But even those remaining had their limits, and she was reluctant to push them lest she found herself facing impossible odds without allies. Nevertheless, the urge was constant, pulsing, trying to guide her hand towards her companion's soft throats. If they weren't around, she could kill without inhibition, an explosive surge of homicidal brutality until she burned out like the tail of a comet. However, something told her that a greater opportunity for slaughter awaited, if only she could make it to the end of the road, intact and in control. So she bides her time, and takes her dark pleasures where she can. Every goblin, every knoll she drops, feeds the endless hunger, screaming for ever more death. No matter its size or complexity, feed me. Some adventure for gold and treasure, some for fame. Some risk their lives on the deadly frontiers of the Sword Coast, simply to make the world a better, safer place. The urge adventured solely because it offered a handy pretext for killing. She got her jollies from the violence. She needed no other reward. Even the initially imperative goal of removing the tadpoles would quickly be forgotten when she found out that brainworms can actually increase one's killing power. I suppose my Dark Urge's day-to-day life wasn't dissimilar to that of any dedicated addict. Every moment, every move committed to hustling up the next fix. an all-encompassing obsession that begins to practically define you. I started my urge as a Dark Old One warlock, so on top of the tadpole and the urge to kill, they were connected to and received their powers from an elder god. Though it's hinted that the Dark Old One isn't even aware of it, that you're some kind of parasite, leeching power off this incredibly strange, sleeping being, of an unimaginable age in nature. The mind of my dark urge was a literal and figurative mess. Add a strange dream figure interrupting her sleep into the mix, and it became a legion of different voices and consciousnesses, buzzing through the broken pathways of her mind, trying to influence her decisions, trying to point the weapon in a particular direction. The first settlement the Urge and her party found was a place called The Grove, which was run by a sect of druids. They had taken in a group of tiefling refugees, but decided to evict them and batten down the hatches because an army of goblins had taken up residence in an old fortress not far away, and were planning on attacking. When the party first arrived, they immediately won everyone's trust by helping the refugees fight off a group of goblins who had followed some adventurers straight to the Grove's front gate. Convinced the Dark Urge was a hero, and definitely not just some psychopath who saw an opportunity to draw some blood and jumped on in, they let the group inside the gates and even asked for further help with the situation. They're left free to wander the streets, getting to know everybody. Eventually, our villain meets a young tiefling woman alone on a hill, dressed in motley and trying to work out the lyrics of a song. The Urge inspires her to finish and is treated to an honestly great performance. This is usually a highlight of the first act in a normal playthrough. The bard, Alfira, is a fan favorite. Many players have expressed disappointment that she isn't a possible companion, or at least camp follower. So naturally, a lot of folks on their second playthrough as the Dark Urge were probably excited when Alfira showed up at their camp after meeting them, and asked if she could join them on their adventures. Only excited for a second though, until they remembered what playing as the Dark Urge usually entails. She agreed to let Alfira join the camp, and the following morning, the Urge woke up covered in blood. The horribly brutalized body of Alfira lying close at hand. She had no memory of what had happened, but no doubt as to her culpability. If anything, she wished she could remember. Shame to waste a good time like that. The sloppiness of the act itself, however, could lead to problems. Around the camp, the companions were stirring. You can try to hide Alfira's body before they wake up, but if you fail, you can either come clean or deny it. I denied it, claiming that a wild animal was responsible. I guess they never saw the symbols surrounding the corpse painted in her blood, or the blood on the Urge's face, clothing, and hands, because they bought it. The Urge's secret remains safe for another day. Disturbingly, everyone promptly lets it go and returns to the other matter at hand, what to do about the Grove. There are a few routes you can take here. You can help the tieflings convince the druids to let them stay and defend the Grove together. You can help the druids convince the tieflings to leave, or even convince the two factions to fight each other. One of the tiefling children was caught trying to steal a wooden idol that the druids were using to perform a ritual that would protect them from the impending goblin attack. As the Urge, you can get the tiefling child to try and run away, prompting the head druid's familiar, a large poisonous snake, to pursue and fatally bite her. This event can then be used to incite violence between the two factions. This would probably be the most true-to-character approach for my Dark Urge to take. Here's the thing, however. There's a different option. Join with the goblins and their 3 commanders. One of these commanders is a drow paladin named Minthara. Minthara is a thrall of the newly emerging god, the Absolute. She also has a tadpole in her head, but has no special MacGuffin to protect her from its influence like the Urge and her companions do. Whatever the Absolute is, it can use the tadpoles to control minds. All the leaders of this new cult are tadpoled, and the Absolute uses them to issue orders to its army of devotees. You can recruit Minthara in Act 2, but it requires you to help the goblins in the attack on the grove. Or at least you did. They patched in a non-insane way to recruit her, but when I played you had to do very bad things to recruit the very bad lady. Minthara is one of the only flat-out evil companions you recruit in the game. Asterion and Lysel being the only other arguably evil-aligned party members, the ones who actually like it when you dish out some cruelty. I wanted to get Minthara, frankly, because she was more likely to put up with whatever craziness I got up to. So I decided to go ahead with an obviously and openly evil display of ultraviolence. This went against my initial idea for the character, but the more the game developed, I ended up pushing situations as far as my companions would allow, like they really were the only things holding me back from the edge. So having another evil ally let me get away with worse and worse stuff, as the ability to resist the urge became harder and seemed less necessary. Eventually, the urge would drop the pretense altogether, once she became too powerful to be stopped. Oh, my urge did trick the tiefling girl into getting bit by the snake. She just never told the refugees and incited a revolt. It was an opportunity to end a life, and she was certain to get away with it. Hey, considering what the urge was really planning to do, it was probably a mercy. Better than being chased through the streets by goblins and suffering whatever cruelties they felt inclined to inflict. Later, up on top of the gate to the grove, with companions carefully selected by order of how comfortable they were with perpetrating atrocities, my urge informed the leader of the refugees that he was betrayed, setting a precedent and savoring his surprise and disgust with her sudden heel turn towards chaotic evil. As Minthara and her goblins attacked, the urge fought and killed the man who had asked them for help protecting his people, only to find himself doomed and cornered. At least he was among the first to go. After the main gates had been breached, it was only a matter of flooding into the city with the goblins, making short work of the remaining defenders, and shooting groups of cornered non-combatants, innocents, with arrows and eldritch blasts, until everyone stopped moving. It was an actual bloodbath, and the urge had helped orchestrate it. She couldn't be happier. This, not after seeing Alfira, but this is when the companions came to know their leader wasn't exactly the kitten-rescuing, beacon of hope and inspiration type they'd perhaps hoped she was. She was obviously willing to do anything it took to achieve her ambitions. Regardless, the fact of the matter was that their goals were still aligned. The allies were desperate to find a way to remove the tadpoles. I did lose Will after this. I'd recruited him in the grove, and he was around for maybe a couple of days before his new leader had annihilated everyone he was trying to protect. He left camp after the attack on the grove, which is disappointing. I wish there was some kind of confrontation, or he popped back up at some point to try to kill the urge, but he was never seen or heard from again. I'd never recruited the goody-goody barbarian companion, Karlach, to begin with, because honestly, she was my favorite during the first playthrough, and I didn't want to have to dark urge her at some point. I also never picked up our bestest boy, Scratch, or the owlbear cub that can join the camp, for identical reasons. This is why people recommend the Dark Urge as the second playthrough. It does a great job at personalizing the horror of it all, when you find yourself killing the same people you protected and grew attached to during your first experience with the game. I remember getting pretty upset when Alfira died during my first non-Dark Urge playthrough. She was killed during the raid on the Last Light Tavern. Let's just say that was the day I learned that resurrection spells don't work on non-party members. She's actually a perfect example of what the Dark Urge origin does so well. On my first playthrough, I really liked Alfira, and was kinda taken aback by her meaningless death. She survived the grove and made it to the inn, only to die because she was, again, in the wrong place at the wrong time, but had run out of luck. Second time around, waking up having killed her myself, without as much as a choice being presented, hit like a mace to the temple. After the grove, there's a big party with Minthara and all the goblins. Seeing all those little monsters, drunk and wandering around your camp, you can't help but think, well, this sure is the result of my actions. This was the night the Dark Urge agreed to meet Minthara at a place called Moonlight Towers. At this point, the party was full-on pretending to be loyal to the Absolute. On paper, we'd slaughtered the people of the Grove so we could ingratiate ourselves with and infiltrate the Church of the Absolute. The logic being that if the church members are tadpoled, then they've got to have more information about their shared condition, and possibly even a way to remove them. At least that's what the Urge told her companions whenever it came up. A few nights after the incident with Alfira, the Urge wakes up to find a brand new nocturnal visitor, Sceleritas, a vile imp-like creature, who introduces himself as her butler. He knows exactly who she really is, but refuses to tell her, only congratulating her on a most excellent kill and handing her a reward, which he claims used to belong to her before she'd had her brain rearranged and wormed. Just when you thought it couldn't get any stranger, you find out that you have your very own demon butler. This means she's at least a little more than an amnesiac psycho killer, though. For the first time, finding out who she was in the past becomes a top priority, right up there with getting dewormed. She was previously perfectly happy to focus on the more immediate problem of impending ceramorphosis, the extraordinarily horrific process of the tadpole turning its host into a mind flayer. But now, restoring her lost memories, or at least getting answers, seemed, well, interesting. Especially since Sceleritas had assured her the gifts would keep coming if she kept killing. Not that the Urge needed much motivation in that regard. Things became almost normal for a while. Traveling and common, beautiful death, awaiting anyone unfortunate enough to attack the party. After a series of zany misadventures, she got the rare opportunity to wipe out an entire Githyanki creche, and piss off an almost god, with the Githyanki follower helping to eliminate her own people no less, thus cutting her previous ties and growing more dependent on the party, less likely to fuss when things get even crazier. The balance of taking her fill of lives and maintaining functional ties to both her companions as well as society at large was a constant, precarious feat, like spinning plates with a piece of foot. Lysel was generally pretty down with whatever. The Githyanki are a brutal, murderous species in their own right, and she was more likely to respect the Urge for solving problems via violence than to balk at it, only doing so when the best interests of the party were put aside, so the Urge could knife someone who could have served a better purpose than just being another of their leader's death fixes. Asterion, however, reveled in the mindless bloodshed. He was a vampire spawn after all, so traveling with someone like the Dark Urge was a natural fit. He was even the first to float the "let's take over the world" idea. Shadowheart was the one I was most afraid of losing. It was a very melee-heavy group, and her healing abilities were absolutely necessary for the party's survival. Out of the companions that fought alongside the Urge early on, she seemed to find the excess killing the most distasteful. But by the time she realized what the Urge was really planning, it was too late to leave. Her own goals were her primary consideration, and the ultra-violent company she found herself with seemed like it provided her the best odds for success. It was a purely practical consideration on her part, until it suddenly wasn't. The only other remaining companion, Gale, was sequestered in camp for a few reasons. Mainly, he was likely to flee if the Urge committed any more atrocities. He seemed nervous and on edge whenever talking to her. The events at the Grove had badly shaken the man, and he only survived to the end because I kept thinking, what if I run into a situation where I actually need a wizard? Area of effect spells are king in Baldur's Gate 3, so I refrained from killing him just in case I needed some with a bit more bang than a warlock could dish out. The primary goal now was to travel to Moonrise Tower to meet Minthara, and find out what they could about the Absolute. By now, the Urge had decided that the tadpoles were less important than tracking down clues to her identity. They found out that the MacGuffin they carried mysteriously halted ceramorphosis, with the aid of an unrecognized figure the companions had each seen in their dreams. This dream figure had actually started to suggest that they insert more tadpoles instead of trying to remove the first one, and the Urge decided to give it the old college try, jamming even more worms into her brain. This resulted in the Urge developing some interesting new abilities, and any increase in power translated into greater ability to wreak havoc and end ever more life. When they finally arrived at Moonrise Tower and located Minthara, she was standing trial and defending her performance to one of the higher-ups in the Cult of the Absolute. Ketheric Thorm, the reputedly immortal chosen of Merkel, god of the dead. The party arrived near the end of the proceedings, to the obvious surprise of Ketheric and his attendants, who clearly recognized the Urge. After trying and failing to get Minthara off the hook, the Urge tried to pry more information from Ketheric, but was left fairly disappointed. He, like Sceleritas, knew exactly who the Urge used to be, but was being less than forthcoming with the information. All that could be learned was that the Urge used to be very high up in the cult, until whatever had happened that left her brain scrambled and housing a wiggly new friend. The Urge resolved to make Ketheric tell everything he knew, and regret treating her so dismissively. Minthara was taken to the prison underneath the tower, and the party followed. They freed Minthara and got to drop a couple people along the way as an added bonus. Lying their way out the front gates and into the surrounding Shadowlands, the Urge was able to extend the power of the MacGuffin to Minthara and share all that she knew up to that point, via tadpole telepathy. The party had gained a new member almost as malevolent as the Urge herself. The bar could be lowered once again, the facade of sanity scraped a tiny bit thinner. Back at camp, the Urge conversed with the Drow Paladin, learning that now her mind was free, Minthara's new primary goal was killing Ketheric Thorm. This made things so much easier. His death had recently jumped to the top of the Urge's to-do list as well, only for different reasons. Minthara wanted revenge, the Urge answers, as well as the promise of fighting a so-called immortal champion of the god of death. Lysel was replaced on the front line by Minthara, where she was soon joined by the Urge herself. A few mechanical details about how I was playing the Urge. At 6th level, I had multi-classed into Paladin. You can get 12 levels of experience in Baldur's Gate 3, and my Urge would ultimately have 5 levels in Pact of the Blade Warlock, 5 in eventually Oathbreaker Paladin, and 2 in Fighter. I chose the same build for Minthara, so I had 2 of these beasts running around absolutely slaughtering everything. This character build is, well, broken, and 2 of them almost effortlessly decimated everything. I never increased the difficulty because I liked the idea of the Urge being the scariest thing in the game. After leaving Moonrise Tower, the party went in search of the source of Ketheric's immortality, but found themselves at an inn that was protected by a mysterious bubble of moonlight. Last Light Inn was the only remaining part of the Shadowlands not consumed by a draining tenebrosity. The Shadowlands got its name after a curse was placed on the area by Shar, the goddess of darkness, the Lady of Loss. Shar cursed the land after inciting a conflict with followers of her sister, Saloon, goddess of the moon, who were the dominating force in the land before Shar worship started spreading throughout the population like a silent plague, until finally they had large enough numbers to strike. This curse covered the land with consuming darkness, turning those unfortunate enough to be engulfed by the gloom into terrifying shades, killer sentient shadows that attacked anything living on sight. The people hiding in the Last Light Inn were led by a woman named Jaheira, who was an ally and canon party member of Abdel Adrian, the Ballspawn player character from the first 2 Baldur's Gate games. She was a dangerous, legendary figure who had also made it her goal to kill Ketheric Thorm. Guy's got a lot of enemies, what can I say? The Urge was actually planning on taking her up on her offer to band together for an attack on Moonrise Tower after whatever force powering Ketheric's immortality was identified and destroyed. It made perfect sense. Use Jaheira's forces to take down Ketheric, then later, should an opportunity present itself, maybe Jaheira and her surviving force beat an unfortunate fate of their own. Hey, happens every day. This was the plan, at least until Sceleritas visited once again that night. The one responsible for keeping the darkness at bay, the real Last Light at the Last Light Inn, was a cleric of the goddess Saloon, a woman named Isabel. The imp barely even had to offer the Urge a reward. Once he got her thinking about what would happen to all those people if their protecting light were to flicker and fade, there wasn't any other conceivable path forward. When that light went out, and the shadows started creeping in, oh, the delicious screams, confusion, terror, agony, each a single note in a vast range of complex flavors. like a fine wine or expensive cigar. The looks on their faces when they realize what happened. The frantic attempt to escape their fates, like rats scrambling against the walls of a maze, finding it pointless as the shadows come in from all sides. The music of their screams during the lingering agony of their deaths. The urge simply had to see it, hear it, taste it. They'd manage without Jaheira or her forces, somehow. The promise of perpetrating a slaughter of this caliber was simply too rich of an opportunity to pass up. Sceleritas would also grant her more information about her past, as well as a shiny new gift. Assassinating Isabel and letting her people die wouldn't seem like a smart move to the companions, but it was something the urge had to risk. She tried to convince herself that it was the promised information that motivated, not the temptation of new blood, but it was hopeless. Murder was, as always, her primary consideration. After heading to Isabel's quarters and rapidly dealing with an unexpected distraction, which during a normal game is the fight at the Last Light Inn, the urge attacked Isabel unprovoked. The party, while confused and frustrated, followed lead, and Isabel, the cleric of Saloon, went down, like they always did. The light she had conjured to protect the survivors at the inn was soon extinguished. And then the real fun began, as the shadows rapidly realized the inn's protection had failed. As the party descended the staircase into the gibbering hell they had created, Jaheira spotted them. She'd quickly realized their betrayal, but other problems were sprouting up all around her as the hungry shadows possessed the terrified survivors and started turning against both Jaheira and the urge. I don't know what she was thinking, but Jaheira suggested working together to fight them off, then settling up after the battle. The urge, smiling inwardly, agreed. She had no intention of letting Jaheira survive the fight. The urge was ecstatic. Not only did she get to hear the lovely song of surprise, terror, pain, as the shadows hunted their prey, but she would now get the chance to play with their possessed remnants. The battle went smoothly for the party, who made sure to let Jaheira wear herself down, fighting large groups unassisted. Eventually, when she was nearly dead, they made certain that they dealt the final blow. It's ironic that this old legend, who was famously the lifelong traveling companion of the most well-respected ballspawn to ever live, was ultimately brought down by one of her old friend's siblings. She had spent her adventuring career watching Abdel resist the urge for bloodshed, only to be murdered by one who embraced it so thoroughly that it defined them. The companions were pissed. This was the first time their leader had decided to just end everyone without even the pretext of a strategy. Officially, they had helped wipe out the Grove in order to infiltrate the cult of the Absolute. Jaheira and her forces could have been pivotal in the coming assault on Moonrise Tower. It cost them nothing to play along and attack together. All of the companions had been inside Moonrise, and they all had serious doubts about mounting a successful offensive with just the four of them. Even Minthara was baffled by the sheer thoughtlessness of what had just transpired. More than anything, it made them doubt the mental stability of their leader. It was the first large crack in the mask. That night, Sceleritas returned and finally told the urge who she really was, about her dark heritage. She was, you guessed it, a ballspawn, progeny of the Lord of Murder himself. In exchange for her offerings at the inn, her father had blessed her with one of his 3 forms. The Dark Urge could now transform into a deadly serpentine creature called the Slayer. But what to do with the new revelation? Sceleritas didn't tell her about her recent past, like how her brains came to be scrambled and inhabited by the endless echoing voices, as well as the larval form of one of the worst things in the plains. Nevertheless, the new knowledge was a game changer. She wasn't crazy after all. Not really. She was born for one purpose alone, and it was one she was very much overeager to fulfill at any opportunity. She was special, the child of a god, or at least something pretty close to one. She contained a sliver of his divinity, as well as his infinite hunger and capacity for violence. After so many sleepless nights spent anxious, not only of the unexplained and often inconvenient urge, but by the implications of it, she had reached the conclusion that she was probably completely insane. But it didn't matter. She just didn't care enough about other living things to bother trying to deny herself the sheer bliss that followed her random acts of brutality, only now to learn that she wasn't actually crazy. She had been fulfilling her purpose all along. She had been feeding her father the lives she stole from others, even if she didn't know it and was doing it to fulfill her own sick needs. She was functioning precisely as designed. Such a powerful machine she must be, to have the killing urge survive the erasure of memory and motive. Now came a sense of great empowerment. She felt justified, divinely mandated. The companions would see her turn into the Slayer at some point, if she ever planned on using it in combat anyway. So it's probably time to come clean to her allies, and them alone. Time to tell them about her true nature. Hey, at least it should explain why she decided to give up a huge advantage in order to indulge in mindless cruelty. They were growing powerful now, individually and as a group. Surely they'd see the value in being led by someone with a divine mission. Of course, they wouldn't know what that mission truly entailed, not until it was too late. She slept well for the first time since escaping her pod back in the Mind Flayer ship. She was a weapon with a purpose, the trajectory she must follow becoming clearer by the moment. Nothing could stop her now, not with Bhaal on her side. Tomorrow she would tell her companions. They needed to hear something to soothe away the apprehension brought on by the madness at the inn anyway, so why not the good news of their leader's divine origins? Besides, everyone on the Sword Coast had heard stories about the Bhaal spawn. Any of them having second thoughts might just be a little too terrified to attempt an escape from her service. The Urge had developed a bit of a relationship with Minthara since they had rescued her from Moonrise Tower. Well, actually it began the night of the Goblin Party, but Minthara had been under the control of the Absolute, so the Urge didn't count it. Since it didn't count, she'd also had a couple of, new experiences with Lysel, but cut that off when Minthara had returned, free of the Absolute's influence. This is when the Urge began to kind of trust Minthara, at least as much as she could trust anyone. She was almost as twisted as the Urge herself, but a lot more pragmatic with her applications of violence. The Urge saw this focus on practicality to be an asset, a counterbalance that could keep the Urge from making unfortunate decisions, the kind with actual ramifications. Of course, this also meant that Minthara wasn't too happy about the completely needless demise of the cleric, Jaheira, and everyone else at the inn. Nevertheless, the Urge told Minthara the truth first. She trusted her to see reason and understand the value of her connection to Bhaal. Winning Minthara to her side quickly would also be useful in bullying the rest into acceptance. Minthara scolded the Urge for giving away an advantage and was disturbed by her admittance that she could barely control herself, but was intrigued by the possibilities that opened up now that she knew her lover was Bhaalspawn. Once Minthara had set the tone, the other companions fell into line, each berating her in their own way for the folly of the attack on the inn, but relenting when they heard why she had done it. That she had planned on doing the smart thing, but had received alternate directions from the god of murder. Her newfound ability to shift into the Slayer, as well as her long history of leaving bodies in the party's wake, served as proof enough. Her behavior was pretty much normal for a Bhaalspawn. They had all heard the stories, and were happier remaining on the side that didn't get knifed in the dark. Finally, the party headed for the hidden temple of Shar, which allegedly held the source of Kethric's immortality. While inside Moonrise Tower, they had learned of someone named Balthazar, not that Balthazar, who was responsible for whatever dark magic let Thorm survive axes to the throat and whatnot. Outside of the temple, they encountered Raphael, a devil that had offered them a deal before they had razed the grove. He sounded like he was warning the party, but really he wanted their help in killing another devil who was apparently a rival of some sort. The Urge had wanted to gut Raphael the first time she saw him, and the only thing that had changed was the level of serration on the blade she would use. Oh, to kill a devil. Such a rare feat. one befitting a child of Bhaal. As the fiend prattled on, the Urge's eyes glazed over as she fantasized about his haughty grin being peeled from his face. They agreed to kill the idiot's rival if they got an opportunity. Call it an hors d'oeuvre, a little warm-up before Raphael himself. Once inside the temple, Shadowheart immediately became agitated. She was a cleric of Shar, a secret she had needlessly guarded. It also helped explain her willingness to look the other way while the Urge ate puppies. Well, figuratively. She was used to people viewing her as evil, but still clearly anxious about her leader slowly losing control of what had turned out to be a mile-wide sadistic streak. When the Urge told her who she really was, Shadowheart was the only companion that brought up the fact that not all Bhaalspawn were evil. Some of them refused to heed the will of their dark father. Something bothered the Urge about Shadowheart's obsession with becoming a Dark Justiciar. She was concerned that if the cleric got what she wanted and became one of Shar's elite, she might become a fanatic of some sort, less controllable, or even gain ambitions of her own besides getting the worm removed from her head and fighting the Absolute. The Dark Urge needed her followers focused on her goals, not running off doing the bidding of some dark goddess. Her position as the party's healer also made her indispensable. As the group descended deeper into the temple, completing Shar's tests as they went, Shadowheart came to sound more and more like a religious zealot. With each step taken, she became more certain that she was about to achieve her life goal, and be chosen as Shar's special girl or something. Each step towards this goal was a step away from the Dark Urge. They found Balthazar, and still undercover, convinced him to let them help gain entry to Shar's realm, the Shadowfell, where the artifact Nightsong awaited. This artifact was the device that granted Ketheric Thorm his immortality. It was what they had come to destroy. They found Raphael's devil buddy a bit deeper in and had a little devil-killing test run before gaining access to the bottom of the temple, where the portal to the Shadowfell was located. Shadowheart was bubbling with anticipation. Through this portal lay the final test that would elevate her to the rank of Dark Justiciar, the killing of a worshipper of Saloon. Nightsong, the artifact that Balthazar was using to make Ketheric invincible, was actually a person. More than a person. She was an Aasimar named Dame Aelin, as well as an immortal daughter of the goddess Saloon. After revealing their ruse and killing Balthazar, Shadowheart was preparing to do the same to the Nightsong and complete Shar's final test, when the Urge talked her out of it? Now I know what you're thinking. Let me explain. This was my second playthrough, so I knew that Aelin and the cleric Isabel were one of those forever couples you sometimes hear tell of. They were inseparable from the moment they met, and being apart from each other was torture for them both. Isabel had actually died before Aelin was imprisoned, but was later resurrected by, here's a twist, her father, Ketheric, the chosen of Merkel. This is the reason why Ketheric was willing to do anything, for Merkel. Ketheric did not, however, tell his immortality battery that the love of her life was back amongst the living. Isabel, meanwhile, had to live with the loss of both Aelin and her father, as Ketheric was pretty much just a hollow shell filled with Merkel's evil at this point. I also knew that both Isabel and Aelin will join your camp if you rescue both of them. I decided to spare her for two reasons. First, I'd already, oopsied Jaheira and her Harpers, so I didn't have any help with the pretty rough battle I knew was coming. Second, I thought Aelin would eventually find out that you had re-killed her girlfriend, and some real crazy stuff would pop off. At least more interesting than Shadowheart poking an incapacitated Aelin to death with a pointy stick in order to gain some spooky girl powers. So, not only did the Dark Urge rescue the daughter of a goody-goody goddess, but also oversaw the party's cleric switch teams from Shar to Saloon, like we owed her a replacement or something. This would be a little rough for me to explain in role-playing terms, so yeah, I thought it would lead to even darker stuff, but it never actually did, and this disappoints me. Aelin never finds out that Isabel was resurrected, and that her rescuer had been the one who'd offed her the second time. Unless I missed something, you never even get the option to tell her yourself, and then end her, while she's at her absolute lowest point. Finding out that you were saved by, fought alongside, and then started following the person who'd killed the love of your life, and was pretty much the polar opposite of yourself, the child of Bhaal, god of murder? Yeah, that's gotta be one of the worst psychological torments I can think of. Exactly the kind of thing I was hoping the Dark Urge playthrough would get up to. But it never happened. She just becomes a camp follower, if you allow it, and stands in a corner offering the same dialogue options until Act 3. Now that Ketheric had been denied his source of invulnerability, it was time to assault Moonrise Tower. Pretty much alone. Aelin was supposed to be around somewhere. This would prove to be quite an undertaking, but such were the consequences of giving up major strategic advances in favor of watching a whole lot of people die for your amusement. This was one of those battles where I won after several tries, and even then with a single party member left standing. If I have one hint to offer, it's use Hunger of Hadar. I haven't talked much about the Absolute itself, as in the thing that the Cult of the Absolute worships, an entity that utterly controls them. The officers of the cult, including Minthara, are all tadpoled, just like the Dark Urge and her companions. The artifact that Shadowheart possesses shields the party from the Absolute's influence, for the most part, and prevents them from becoming enthralled. This function is facilitated by the actions of the Dream Visitor, who is fighting a one-person war against... You know what? This is a video about the Dark Urge playthrough. It's not meant to be a thorough story breakdown. All you need to know about the MacGuffin for now is that it protects the party from the Absolute, which it turns out is an Elder Brain. Which is essentially the actual intelligence behind the hive mind of a Mind Flayer colony. In the same way that the brain could control entire cities of Mind Flayers, it controlled the high-ranking members of the cult via the tadpoles. Somehow this brain could either delay the transformation of tadpoled individuals, or bring the change on instantly, turning a cult member into an Illithid within moments. Thing is, these guys are huge, like real huge. So they had it sequestered in a cave underneath Moonrise Tower, along with an entire Mind Flayer colony. You can find a part of the wall in Moonrise Tower with some goo dripping out, and if you're dumb enough to stick your hand inside, you can meet the Absolute a little earlier than you normally would, and get a few juicy lore nuggets. Of chief importance to us, the fact that the Absolute knows exactly who the Dark Urge is. Who the hell was she in the cult? At this point, you'd be forgiven for thinking you were the leader, and you wouldn't be too far off. Every cult muckety-muck you've met looks at you and says something like, "Oh, it's you. You're alive. Great." Anyway, after the party fights its way through Moonrise, right when the Urge had Ketheric cornered and thought they were about to end things, a gigantic tentacle ripped its way free from a turret and rescued him, dragging him, as well as Aelin, down into the Illithid colony below. So the party followed, and fought through the Mind Flayer colony, which had a lot of stuff, but not many actual Mind Flayers. Lots of reminders of all the evil crap the Urge had pulled over the course of the game, though, if only in the form of things that weren't there. In one room, you're supposed to save the leader of the Tieflings from the Grove, as well as multiple other innocents captured by the cult. But the Urge had killed them all weeks ago, so they never got captured and placed in the colony. There is one thing specifically here for the Urge, however. You run into a group of cultists, and the one in charge claims to have been present for your tadpoling, and responsible for a not inconsiderable amount of torturing you and screwing around with your mind before you were placed in the tube on the Mind Flayer ship. She wasn't the one who originally cut your mind to ribbons, but she had played around with the pieces afterwards. You kill her and all her friends, of course. When you reach the chamber housing the Elder Brain at the bottom of the colony, you encounter several different people, 3 of which are having an argument. The 3 true leaders of the cult of the Absolute are finally revealed to the Urge and her allies. Ketheric Thorm you already know, but also present is a finely dressed, smug-looking young man named Gortash, as well as an absolutely psychotic-looking young woman named Orin the Red, wearing what the internet has lovingly dubbed slutty crab armor. They, like any good troop of villains, are openly discussing their plans, unaware of your presence. They each have a magic stone that, when put together like the rings in Captain Planet, gives them the ability to control the Elder Brain, and thus the cult of the Absolute. These suckers have managed to take over an Elder Brain and use it to control a whole slew of individuals they've managed to tadpole, thus slowly creating the cult, one brainworm at a time. Now, however, they were going to transport the brain to a cave underneath Baldur's Gate, and use it to throw a bunch of quinceañeras or something like that. After Gortash and Orin leave for Baldur's Gate with the brain, Ketherick is left behind to finish off the Urge and her party, then take possession of the MacGuffin, as it's the only thing that can be used to fight the brain. So it's probably not wise to continue to let this gang of adventurers led by a ball spawn run around freely with it, especially when you've had previous experience with said ball spawn, and know exactly how dangerous she can be. It probably wasn't smart to leave it to Ketherick, though, since he'd already been beaten by the group once and predictably loses again, despite turning into a totally metal giant Grim Reaper and absolutely savaging the party for a while before being taken down. Since the Absolute had wisely snagged Aelin at the same time it rescued Ketherick, he began the fight immortal again. But even that didn't save him. And so, finally, the party heads to Baldur's Gate. Well, not quite. You're ambushed in the night by a bunch of Githzerai, the other faction of Gith besides the Githyanki. It's a whole thing. You find out the Githzerai are an honor guard for the source of the MacGuffin's power, which we'll return to later. Promise. The dream figure turns out to be a friendly mind flayer? Perhaps two friendly mind flayer. His name's the Emperor. This is the guy who's been using the artifact to keep the Absolute off your back the whole game. And here, he gives you the option to become a Mind Flayer hybrid. This comes with a lot of power, so of course the Urge jumps on that opportunity and learns how to fly, among some other neat new tricks. She's a real supervillain now! You get new Mind Flayer powers by consuming the tadpoles that you, assumedly, dig out of officers of the Cult of the Absolute skulls. So I went the all for Homer route with these brainworms and jammed every one the party found up the Dark Urge's nose, maxing out her Mind Flayer abilities and making her even more of a monster on the battlefield. After choosing to trivialize the rest of the game with a combination of a broken character build and maximum Chaos Worm potential, the party finally arrives in Baldur's Gate. Actually, it's a town right outside of Baldur's Gate. Game really makes you work for it, huh? You still have like half the third act to get through before you arrive at the city proper. God. Rivington is a district in the outer city of Baldur's Gate, located on the southern edge of the river Shionthar. It's here the Urge and her companions arrive at the beginning of the final act of Baldur's Gate 3. This is where all the disparate ends of the story start to tie themselves into a more or less coherent little bow. Now that they've hit the big time, as it were, the first thing the group of adventurers did was go to a circus. Because circus. This was an interdimensional circus, with many of the performers being outsiders, which are beings that originate from a different plane of existence. They were gathered here to work as carnies and generally sketchy entertainers. They had a couple of cages holding beings that looked like panthers with tentacles sprouting from their backs, displacer beasts. Even while attending a circus, the Urge was always looking for opportunities to create her own fun. So she ordered Asterion to go invisible and unlock the cages, while the party stood across the courtyard, watching the freed beasts kill circus attendees in peace. They ate a few random people before the guards got a hold of the situation, and afterwards it was back to business as usual for the circus. They didn't even cancel the clown performance. The party gathered to watch the show and soon learned that the clown was actually a kind of shapeshifter who had murdered the real clown and set an ambush for the Dark Urge. Some of the animal handlers were also doppelgangers and were supposed to release the displacer beasts when the clown attacked the party. But with the Urge being the Urge, they'd already been released and used for the Urge's own vicious purposes. Without the beast's backup, the clown and his associates went down easy. But it was only the beginning of the assassination attempts. The cult knew the Urge and her party had arrived, and were doing what they could to keep them from reaching Gortash or Orin. These weren't members of the Cult of the Absolute, though. They were members of the Cult of Bhaal, which to the Urge meant they should be working for her. If you haven't guessed it, the Urge used to know Orin quite well. A cutscene in between Act 2 and 3 reveals that Orin was the one responsible for taking the Urge out of the picture for a time. The Urge used to be the chosen of Bhaal, and one of the 3 leaders of the cult of the Absolute, but had been betrayed by Orin. It was her that had tadpoled the Urge and sliced into her brain, resulting in her amnesia. The Urge had been the head of the cult of Bhaal, as well as, one of the 3 heads of the Absolute, and Orin had usurped her positions after her betrayal. Orin was also Bhaalspawn, I guess, being a blood relative of Sarevok Anchev. I still don't agree with it being a hereditary thing. Bhaalspawn are supposed to contain a piece of Bhaal, and it wasn't exactly something that got passed on with chromosomes. The main personality difference between Orin and the Urge was that Orin was a force of pure chaos, killing indiscriminately and without caring about the consequences. She was a loose cannon. The Dark Urge was the more strategic-minded of the two, being an absolutely brutal killer, but usually able to stay her hand if it better suited her objectives. She was smart about it and knew when to hold back in service to a greater scheme. This was a characteristic that had survived her tadpoling and crude brain surgery, with a couple of glaring exceptions. Orin, a shapeshifter herself, started popping up all over the city after the circus attack. God, that's fun. She'd take the form of random people, and when the Urge would stop to talk to them, she'd toy with her for a while before changing back into Orin in order to threaten the Urge and basically do the whole "Dad always liked you best" routine. These little visits, along with various cultist ambushes, are peppered throughout the first half or so of Act 3. Also of note in Rivington is a camp full of monster hunters. The Urge had let Asterion negotiate with one who was hunting him back in Act 1, but now they wanted Asterion to destroy his former master, who kidnapped a bunch of their members and kids as a form of recompense for all the harm he caused throughout the centuries of his unlife. Unfortunately, Asterion is Asterion, and this wouldn't turn out the way they wanted. Asterion, the vampire spawn, had been enslaved by a powerful vampire lord named Cazador. The tadpole and the protection of the MacGuffin had broken this control, as well as letting Asterion walk freely in the daylight. He of course used his newfound freedom and bounty of bloodthirsty companions to plot his revenge. After running into some of his siblings at a flophouse, he learns that Cazador is sending the hunters after him because he needs him back for a ritual that would allow Cazador to become an ascended vampire. One that doesn't have to drink blood to survive and can walk in the sun. Seeing this as a way to take over the world, Asterion quickly sets his sights on hijacking the ritual, killing Cazador, and ascending himself. This plan is wholeheartedly supported by the Dark Urge. Anything that could make her party more capable in the old murder department was A-okay with her. Asterion was one of her more like-minded companions. He was totally fine with all the random bloodshed, and didn't bat an eye at the news that his leader was Bhaalspawn. He saw opportunity in it. Asterion would stick with the Urge until the end of the whole mess, and after that, if he made a move against her, she'd deal with it then. The challenge was getting to the end, and she needed whatever advantages she could find. Later on in Act 3, Asterion succeeds in this goal, killing Cazador and using the life forces of his fellow vampire spawn to ascend. Those he had drained included the captured monster hunters he was supposed to rescue. Somehow already knowing what had happened, the Gur, the clan of hunters, attacked the Urge and her party, trying to get to Asterion. This was a really bad idea, and it ended about how you'd imagine. The last thing of note in Rivington was the murder in a temple. The case had previously been investigated by a Hollyphant... Man, I don't know, man. I don't know. Detective. The Hollyphants are little celestial flying elephant people, native to all of the Good-aligned planes. This specific Hollyphant was named Inspector Valeria, and she was kind of an ass. Pretentious, self-righteous, lazy, and alcoholic. She had closed the case of the temple murders without any real thought or effort. It turns out that the murders were only part of a series of brutal ritualistic killings, perpetrated by an aspirant of the Church of Bhaal. The deaths were his tryout for the murder club, okay? The Urge started hunting this guy as she believed he would eventually lead her to the cult itself, where she could re-establish her authority and take the organization back from Orin the Red. When confronted by sufficient evidence, Valeria, lazy as usual, punch you to her partner, who, it turns out, had been going on about the cult of Bhaal for weeks, while Valeria continued to drink herself into a stupor. The urge lies to the Hollyphant? God, I'll never get that right, man. I can't. The urge lies to Valeria's number 2, admitting that she's a Bhaal spawn, but convincing her she's one of the good ones, like that Abdel guy, and totally wanted to stop the cult. Valeria's partner stupidly believes her and gives her even more information on the cult of Bhaal. The urge had really developed a taste for getting people to trust her, only to stab them in the back at the worst possible time. Then finish them off when they were racked with all the guilt and shame and anger that she could pack into the eventual betrayal. She would play the role of their last hope, then luxuriate in the flood of negative emotions that resulted from cruelly stripping that hope away after the victim had entrusted her with everything. Regardless, the urge does track down and dispatch this killer, after letting him claim a final victim. Afterwards, the urge finds a bag full of the hands of his victims that were to be presented to the cult preceding his induction into the coterie of Bhaalist assassins. During the investigation, the urge had learned of a kind of recruitment office for the cult, thematically hidden underneath the coffin maker's place of business. With her fresh bounty of severed hands in tow, the urge went to this recruitment office, intending on reintroducing herself and taking back her authority over the cult. Presenting the stolen hands as proof of her abilities and commitment to Bhaal, she was allowed into the inner sanctum, where sitting on a throne before her was a reanimated Sarevok, the Bhaal spawn who tried to kill Abdel Adrian before he became a threat and came extremely close to taking over the city. He was the main antagonist of Baldur's Gate 1. Sarevok is weirdly grandfatherly towards the urge. He's Orin's actual relative, but doesn't approve of the way she tries to kill people in fancy artistic ways. She simply misunderstands what Bhaal ultimately wants, which is only deaths. Deaths in droves, according to Sarevok. Bhaal cares nothing for creative kills, or elaborate signatures written in blood, or any of the rest of Orin's dramatics. The speech comes off as, "Back in my day, we'd cut 6 throats on our way to school. Don't you know, getting all fancy with the bodies just wastes time you could spend killing more people?" He tells you how jealous Orin always was of you, how she hated you and plotted behind your back. He urges you to kill Orin and retake control of the church, asking you to drop back in after she's dead. Maybe for some scones. Finally, some actual progress toward the urge's true goals. A ceremony takes place, allowing her to renew her allegiance and once again become an official assassin of Bhaal. Remember Inspector Valeria? Well, somewhere along the way, the drunken fool got herself captured by the cult and was chained up in the next room. The urge ritualistically murders the defenseless flying elephant thingy and bathes in the Celestial's blood, re-emerging once again as a true child of Bhaal. Her allies stand mere feet away, watching this all happen without comment. The area beyond Rivington is a fortress island called Worm's Crossing. The fortress itself, Worm's Rock. This is where Lord Enver Gortash, arms dealer and all-around smug and self-satisfied guy, was about to be sworn in as the Grand Duke of Baldur's Gate, after being arrested while trying to enter the crossing by one of Gortash's giant mechanical killing machines called Steel Watch. The Urge and her companions soon get free and are weirdly invited to attend the coronation ceremony, which they do. Each leader of the Cult of the Absolute was the chosen one, or super special boy or girl, of a respective member of the Dead Three. Lord Enver Gortash was the chosen of Bane, god of tyranny. After the ceremony takes place, making Gortash officially the leader of the city, he cheerfully converses with the Dark Urge, like they were old friends. Because they were. This is where most of the Dark Urge's past is made clear, as Gortash ends up being a surprisingly straight shooter. As Sarevok details the Urge's past with the cult of Bhaal, Gortash makes clear the Urge's past with the cult of the Absolute. So it turns out, the Urge came up with the entire plan to use an Elder Brain to start a cult and take over the world. Because of course she did. Who else? She was there from the very beginning, the original chosen of Bhaal, entrusted with one of the 3 netherstones that, when combined, allow the 3 chosen to maintain control over the brain. Then Orin betrayed and maimed her and took her place as the new chosen, stealing her thunder and reaping the rewards of the Urge's ingenious plan. Because of her, let's say, unpredictable nature, Gortash hated Orin, but he actually liked the Dark Urge. He deeply respected her, particularly her ability to make a plan, let it ripen, and not spoil the whole thing by randomly flatlining everyone, an ability in which Orin was markedly deficient. The Urge felt satisfied. It made sense. In hindsight, of course she was responsible for everything that had happened. She'd come up with a magnificent scheme to send her father mountains of the one thing he truly cared for. Deaths in droves. She was proud. The crown, the stones, all of it was her idea. It would have worked had Orin not tried to ruin everything. It still could work. The Urge was damaged, but still alive. Gortash was offering to really himself with the Urge if she killed Orin, something she already very much planned on doing. Gortash seemed truly genuine. Take Orin out of the picture and the 2 of them take over the Sword Coast. He was smart. He would gladly share power with her, rather than lose it all fighting with Orin and the Dark Urge at the same time. After all, he genuinely respected her abilities. Unfortunately for him, the Urge didn't have any warm, fuzzy memories of Gortash, the way he seemed to have of her. She also didn't have any desire whatsoever to share power with anyone else. She could see the road that would lead her to her vile throne, and she would take it. There was a place for her companions, this being kneeling in front of her, but no place for Gortash. Or Orin. She already had Kethric's Netherstone. Kill Orin and Gortash, and she wouldn't need any partners. Only thralls. She agreed to the deal with Gortash, for now. It would keep him off her back while she retook her cult from Orin and tied up a few other loose ends, like the devil Raphael. The Urge still dreamed of killing him. His ego rubbed her the wrong way. He had presumed that because he was a devil, he could always set the terms, even when dealing with someone like the Dark Urge. They had recently encountered the devil on the top floor of a brothel in Baldur's Gate. To his credit, he did finally come out with it and told the Urge what he actually wanted from her. It wasn't whatever she had that may have qualified as a soul, but the crown of Karsus. This was a relic, she had learned, that Gortash and herself had stolen from Mephistopheles, the second most powerful lord of hell. It was the crown that was used to control the Elder Brain. Raphael would have had better luck bargaining for her soul. The crown of Karsus, staying right where it belonged, was critical to the plans that were just now coalescing in her broken mind. In exchange for the crown, he was offering an artifact that he believed to be of equal use, at least to the Dark Urge. A hammer that could smash anything hell-forged. Like, say, the chains binding a nearly forgotten Gith prince, who'd been sealed away in a certain MacGuffin forever ago. A power source. One that could be used to repel the mind-controlling abilities of an Elder Brain. One that, until quite recently, used to have an honor guard. Oops. I'm not trying to go through millennia of Gith history here, but the entire race used to be enslaved by the Mind Flayers, back when they controlled the universe. There was a woman named Gith, who became the people's namesake by leading a successful rebellion against the Illithid Empire. Later, she made a deal with the dragon god Tiamat that resulted in the Gith gaining access to red dragon mounts. But then she disappeared, never to be seen again. Civil war broke out amongst the Gith, as they split into 2 factions, Gith Yankee and Gith Zerai. Gith's only son Orpheus was part of the Gith Zerai. He found out that the woman who'd taken over after Gith disappeared had actually betrayed his mother, and was the real reason why Gith vanished. She did away with her so she could take Gith's place. This woman was named Vlaakith. Not the one who's really super mad at the Dark Urge and her party right now. The first one. There's been a whole lot of Vlaakiths. Orpheus and OG Vlaakith fought a battle where Orpheus accused her of her crimes and claimed to be the true heir and ruler of the Gith. He was defeated, but Vlaakith, not wanting to waste all his juicy power, trapped him in a device that focused his energy in such a way that it could be used as a weapon against the Mind Flayers. The hammer that Raphael was offering to trade for the Crown of Karsus could be used to free him from his bondage. The idea was that Orpheus would be grateful and not at all immediately wreck up his half-illithid, all-psycho savior. Surely such a wise being, who's been chained up in a fancy D20 for millennia, would see the bigger picture and help them fight the Absolute. It certainly wasn't anything the Urge would trade an artifact powerful enough to control an Elder Brain for. At least, not while the one part of the plan she'd actually worked out was just take control of the Elder Brain. But hey, it might come in handy. The Urge hadn't quite figured out what to do with the whole dream visitor that ended up being a mind flayer that then tried to seduce her situation. But it was open to pretty much any option that didn't involve her having to share power with someone in the end. The Urge told Raphael where he could stick his hammer, ignoring his dire warnings that time was running out, and soon he'd be the only option they had left, and blah, 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 blah. It was time to go on the offensive. Raphael had been allowed to blather on long enough. The hammer may or may not prove useful, but humiliating Raphael, an extremely powerful devil, was definitely one for the bucket list. The Urge knew she couldn't permanently kill him. He would reform in hell eventually, as his kind generally did. But he'd learned that even devils didn't stand a chance against the favored child of Bhaal. Also, surely this would damage his infernal reputation with the rest of his kind. That was probably the worst injury the Urge could inflict. Leaving the brothel, she briefly spoke to Raphael's assistant, who'd apparently been watching the party's every move for weeks on end. It was mostly more doom-calling, saying the Urge should go back and take the deal for everyone's sake, that Raphael was the only one powerful enough to save the Sword Coast, that he wanted to do it. He just needed an incentive, because that's how devils always operate. Again, unfortunately, this fell on deaf ears, as the Urge wanted to dominate and maybe even purge the Sword Coast, not save it. Raphael had told her that he was the only one who could control the crown, but the Urge disagreed. With Bhaal's help, anything was possible. The world was hers alone for the taking. The exchange with the assistant did, however, give her the idea to break into Raphael's home, the House of Hope, to steal the hammer and anything else valuable, and hopefully get a chance to find out what the devil's blood smelled like. Being the city of Baldur's Gate and all, it didn't take the Urge long to find a way into hell, where of course the House of Hope was located. Having heard of the daring heist Gortash and herself had pulled on Mephistopheles in order to steal the Crown of Karsus, she wasn't particularly intimidated. If she could get one over on the second most powerful devil in existence, what did that mean for Raphael? The party had promised the one arranging transit an artifact from Raphael's collection as payment, and set off into one of the most dangerous locales in any of the many planes of existence. The Urge didn't risk this for a magical hammer. She did it solely for a chance to take a few chunks out of Raphael's egotistical throat. The House of Hope was a huge mansion. Most of the inhabitants were the tormented souls of people who'd previously made deals with Raphael. They were trapped there, slowly losing their minds as they suffered for all eternity. One of these sad ghosts was a dwarven woman named Hope. She agreed to help the Urge if they freed her. Her mortal form was chained up in a prison beneath the mansion. Hope led them to the Archivist, who watched over Raphael's treasured artifacts while he was gone. The party naturally killed the Archivist and stole several of the devil's artifacts, but unfortunately the hammer required a passphrase of some sort. After a let's just call it a trade. Yeah, a trade of sorts involving an incubus or succubus or whatever, pick your poison. The party returned for the hammer with the password, unable to look the Urge in the face, after she had just paid quite the steep price for a simple code. Once they took it, everything just kinda exploded. The Urge was just happy to have a distraction, you know. After, the floors, walls, the sad ghosts, all suddenly became fire and went after the party. They were luckily able to dash to the other side of the mansion and enter the prison before the combusting denizens were able to surround them. After a difficult fight involving multiple spectators, which I tend to think of as the weaker kid brothers of beholders, they freed Hope and made to leave the house that, as it turned out, was named for her and the myriad torments Raphael had inflicted on her. As the party approached the portal they had entered through, Raphael, along with a cohort of lesser devils, including the one they had killed in the Temple of Shar, approached them. He had reformed already. The urge had impressed this devil, both by defeating him and having the sheer audacity to enter Raphael's domain and challenge him where he lived. He wasn't exactly overflowing with love for Raphael to begin with, so he switched sides and fought alongside the party. This, by a wide margin, was the craziest battle the Urge had experienced since the giant Grim Reaper Thorm had transformed into, and she was exponentially more powerful than she had been during the battle with Ketheric. Raphael had a devilish life force. In game terms, he had 666 hit points, which was a lot, even for extra heavy hitters like the Urge and Minthara. It was by far the most epic fight in the game. Raphael even gets his own unique and climactic battle song.
Mortal lives expire. Souls go to their dooms.
After taking down Raphael's demon buddies, the party basically just had to slowly whittle away at the powerful demon. Shadowheart was able to quickly heal all the damage he inflicted, so it became a battle of attrition. Would he run out of life, or would the cleric run out of spells? He had several pylons filled with souls that empowered him, and half of the party was sent to break them one by one, while the Urge took his blows and dished out plenty of her own. Once it was done, Raphael was, at least temporarily, no more. He was no longer a nuisance, nosing in where he didn't belong, making plays for the crown that so rightly belonged to the Urge. She had come up with the perfect plan, stolen the crown, started the cult of the Absolute, and had lost her memories and nearly her life over it. She was owed the world for what she'd gone through. The crown would be hers, and anyone in her way would perish. They returned to Baldur's Gate, and the Urge was in a rare good mood. She'd let Hope go free, and even given the one who'd helped them open the way to hell the artifact they'd wanted, without treachery or violence. It was starting to seem pointless to needlessly kill the citizenry of Baldur's Gate. They would all belong to her soon enough. She would dominate them utterly. They would be her playthings to be used and broken as she saw fit. There were so many more interesting ways to bring about their ends than a quick knife in the back. She had to put in extra effort to not drop the bag this close to the end, not to be like Orin and put the immediate satisfaction of mindless chaos over the promise of a mass slaughter that would stain entire chapters of future history books red. She imagined this was how the version of her before Orin and the Tadpole would have handled things, and past Urge was slowly becoming present Urge's sole role model. Raphael was the last real loose end that the Urge felt she needed to tie up. It was time to find Orin. Besides, she'd kinda kidnapped Lizelle some time back, and was probably torturing her or something. Orin had miscalculated in taking Lizelle. The Urge had gotten bored with her as soon as Minthara was back in the picture, and while still with the group, Lizelle was relegated to camp with Gale, eating food and wasting space. Probably a lot of glaring at each other over the fire. However, it was still an act of disrespect, and since the Urge was always going to eradicate Orin anyway, she might as well rescue her ally, now that it was a convenient time to go do so. That was assuming Lizelle was actually still alive, and Orin hadn't offed her as soon as she'd gotten her alone. Why Orin had thought kidnapping an obsolete companion would bother the Urge, she had no idea. But it either meant that Orin was desperate for any advantage he could muster, an idiot, or both. The Temple of Bhaal was hidden in the sewers underneath Baldur's Gate. The Urge had received an amulet from Sarevok that would grant her passage. As she stood at the threshold, about to reclaim her heritage, her rightful position as the chosen of Bhaal, and the head of her father's cult, she couldn't help but realize that this was the beginning of the end. It didn't seem too long ago she was fighting her way out of a crashing Mind Flayer ship, with no idea who she was or how she'd gotten there. Now preceded by an ocean of the dead, she stood at the precipice of her terrifying future, the blood of 1,000 little pleasures staining her calloused hands, the blood of 1,000,000 more waiting to be spilled for her dark father. Only Minthara had any real idea what the Urge was planning. They'd whispered of it in the dead of night as they stood alone together when the paladins were sure no one else was listening. However, even Minthara didn't know everything. Minthara had her own history with Orin the Red. In the past, during a series of altercations and incidents between the Drow of the Underdark and the forces of the Absolute, who wanted to recruit their elite soldiers into the growing force of tadpoled cultists, Minthara had brought a force of Dark Elves to parley with the leaders of the cult of the Absolute. The plan was to ambush the cultists at some point, but before Minthara had her opportunity, Orin had leapt onto the table and skipped merrily toward Minthara, slicing the throats of her seated allies as she went, before reaching and taking possession of the paladin, tadpoling, using, and tormenting her, until the Dark Urge had saved her from her inglorious fate. Minthara hated Orin the Red, and wanted to kill her almost as much as the Urge herself did. She had also realized the opportunity that could arise if they managed to gain possession of all 3 Netherstones. She had suggested it as a course of action, not knowing that the Urge had already considered this to be the plan since they had first learned of the Crown and Netherstones. This shared purpose was perhaps why the two had become about as close as a pair of brutal killers could be. Asterion also knew something was afoot. He'd tossed around the idea of world domination himself a few times, but the Urge had never really trusted him enough to tell him that this was indeed her ultimate goal. Nevertheless, he would hardly be surprised when the time came. Shadowheart, though, the Urge had no idea how she would react, especially now that she had converted to worshipping Saloon. The Dark Urge still traveled with the priestess of a good-aligned goddess, and needed to keep her if she was going to succeed. So the Urge and Minthara kept the ultimate goal to themselves, and let Shadowheart cling to whatever lies she told herself, to continue to justify keeping what amounted to a band of roving killers alive. The Urge was rapidly becoming the most dangerous being on the Sword Coast, and Shadowheart, Cleric of Saloon, was playing a pivotal role in her rise to power. The party entered the Temple of Bhaal and began to fight their way past its defenses, gaining entry to the inner sanctum where Orin awaited. Here the assassins didn't attack, they were expecting her. Many of them wished the Urge luck. It seems Orin was a less than popular leader, a fact which gave the Urge quite a bit of satisfaction. On the central platform of the chamber, Lysel was strapped to a table, ready for vivisection. The Urge didn't care much about whether the Githyanki lived or died. She'd already been cast aside in favor of Minthara, and was all but useless to the Urge at this point. Orin immediately displayed her weakness, and decided to confront the Urge instead of making good on her promise to kill Lysel if the Urge entered the temple while Gortash still lived. In the end, it came to a duel, just the Urge and Orin. The Urge, anticipating Orin's ability to dish out damage very quickly, began the fight by transforming into the Slayer, a move that would hopefully remind Orin that she fought a fellow Bhaalspawn, one that had also been blessed with their father's gifts. It allowed the Urge to absorb Orin's first attacks without sustaining any damage to her true form. There isn't a whole lot left to tell. Orin was no Raphael, and the battle was over quickly. Once the Urge transformed back, she struck Orin with a flurry of divine strikes, and killed her in a single round of combat. The one who disrupted her brilliant plan, had brained the Urge's damage, and usurped her position, now lay in red wreckage at her feet. The Urge relieved the broken body of its Netherstone, and took back her position as the leader of Bhaal's cult of assassins. It was over fast enough to be anticlimactic. After the fight had been decided, Scaleritas appeared near the table Lysel was strapped to. As he approached, he was racked and twisted by an unseen force, as Bhaal violently possessed his body and addressed the Urge directly. At last she was face to face with her father himself. She would become his chosen once again, and promised to serve him and cull the world in his honor. She submitted to him fully. It was her destiny. She had been made for this. If she didn't serve Bhaal, function as his will manifest onto the world, then she was just another low killer. A maniac who spilled blood for no other reason than to see it spatter on the dirt. Without his approval, she felt she was no one and lived for nothing. She owed him everything. She had no desire to go back to knowing nothing but the urge. By serving Bhaal, she knew exactly where the urge came from. She knew its purpose. She was feeding Bhaal, and not just her own sick need to end life. Deaths in droves, Sarevok had told her. Bhaal desired only deaths in droves, and she intended to deliver him just that. She had promised Sarevok she would tell him when Orin was dead, and intended to make good. She figured he'd have some new ceremony waiting, to officially name her Bhaal's chosen. Maybe he had another celestial chained up in the basement, ready to go. Instead, the old evil and his council of ghosts tried to kill her. He alluded to already knowing the outcome, saying it was the Bhaalspawn way, the best death, and thus the best sacrifice to Bhaal that he could ask for. With this final competitor gone, she was now the last surviving leader of the Church of Bhaal. The Urge now found herself with a host of new allies, and a second Netherstone. It was time to return to Gortash and tell him the good news, followed by some very bad news. There was still one more cult to take over before it was through. While they were exploring the Temple of Bhaal, the party had discovered that more than the cult resided in the vast cave network. The Elder Brain had been hidden down here too, but there wasn't much they could do about it without the third Netherstone. Exchanging a knowing glance with Minthara, the Urge returned to Worm's Rock, intent on completing their grim work. One wannabe tyrant wouldn't stand between her and the destiny her father had engineered for her. Before settling with Gortash, the party returned to the rooms they had rented out of the Elfsong Tavern for a much-needed rest. Reclaiming one's destiny is tiring work. Here she found Skeleritas, who seemed to have joined the camp in case the Urge needed any further assistance. He was much more forthcoming now that she was the undisputed head of the church and chosen of Bhaal. She learned that she wasn't like those other girls, but a very different kind of Bhaalspawn. The Urge wasn't the result of a one-night stand with a dragon, or any of the other multitudes of women Bhaal had impregnated in his play to pepper the countryside with little balls, who would grow up to play Highlander until only one remained. She was created from Bhaal's own flesh. He had taken a piece of himself and formed it into the Dark Urge. She was his very embodiment. How could she even imagine disobeying, as some of her more faithless companions had suggested, when she was a part of him given life of its own? At the end of everything, when she stood alone atop a mountain of her offerings to him, it was her father and only her father that she would remain loyal to. Gortash was in his office, surrounded by supplicants and the ever-present automatons he dubbed the Steel Watch. Since the Urge was pretending to be allied with him and not wanting to play her hand too early, she had passed on the opportunity to destroy the factory that produced these behemoths. She was beginning to regret the decision when she entered the room and found several of the large robots present, guarding him. Gortash wasn't one to take many chances. Like Moonrise Tower, they'd manage, somehow. The Urge told Gortash that Orin was dead and was surprised when he impetuously requested her to hand over the Netherstones, a request she flatly refused. She braced herself, expecting it to come to blows earlier than anticipated, but he was only testing her. He respected her even more for standing her ground and refusing to relinquish the stones. The Urge agreed to meet him in the cave where the Elder Brain was sequestered, but then, as soon as his back was turned, the Dark Urge surprised him with a two-handed sword to the face. He put up more of a fight than Orin, but not by much. Gortash was the first to go down. The Steel Watch, however, proved a little more difficult, and put up quite the fight, but it was no use. The battle was won the moment Gortash's brain met the fresh air. With a shudder of anticipation, the Urge dug the final Netherstone out of the custom gauntlet that Gortash always wore, and left Worm's Rock victorious. Her victory was short-lived, however. With the Tyrant's death, the Absolute was making its move. Without the Chosen of the Dead Three controlling it, its chains were quickly breaking, and it was transforming some of the tadpoled members of the cult into Mind Flayers, rapidly forcing them through all the stages of Ceramorphosis, and sending them out onto the streets to wreak bloody havoc. Chaos was beginning to spread throughout the city, and the party had to fight their way back down to the Temple of Bhaal, where they prepared for their confrontation with the Elder Brain itself. The Dark Urge intended to bring this monster that she had created under her control. The citizenry was hers to play with, not the brains. They were intended as gifts for her father. Deep inside the tunnels, they found an underground lake and a conveniently placed rowboat, which they took into the central cavern which housed the brain. As they rowed, each party member stared into the black waters surrounding them, lost in their own thoughts. Whatever happened in the next few hours was going to define their futures, if there even was a future. They could fail and either die or become thralls to the brain, as they were always intended to be. After this happens, the party is forced to swim the rest of the way to shore, where they encounter the psychic force projected by the brain, more powerfully than they had ever experienced before. They were getting close. The artifact still protected them from the brain's control, but not perfectly. Pain from its repeated attempts to enthrall them sent them to their knees as they struggled to maintain control over their faculties. Focused agony pulsing from the worms still embedded in their skulls. The brain wasn't alone. It had amassed what seemed like a small army of intellect devourers. After fighting their way through these throbbing masses, they found their quarry within a huge lake of Mind Flayer brine. The gargantuan cerebrum rose up out of the pool and addressed them with the same telepathic voice they'd been catching whispers of throughout their entire journey, compelling them to submit and be dominated. The brain also had some intriguing details about the Urge's past. She knew controlling the brain via the Crown of Karsus had been her idea, but she hadn't known that she was the one to, personally, place the crown on the Elder Brain. The Absolute seemed to genuinely have some level of respect for her, just as Gortash had. They both seemed somehow in awe of her past self. The brain confided that it would have gone along with her plan if Orin hadn't usurped her and destroyed her mind. However, the moment she had been tadpoled, she had become a pawn in the Elder Brain's design. In order to be freed from the control of the crown, it had needed just one of the Chosen to fall. All 3 stones were needed to fully control the brain, so its eventual freedom had been assured the moment the Urge had killed Ketheric. However, it hadn't anticipated that the Urge would be so effective as to drop all 3 of the Chosen. It was a nice surprise. The brain had intentionally released the Emperor from its thraldom, knowing that he would eventually bring the Urge back to its lair. Everything that had happened was part of its staggeringly detailed plan, its grand design. The Emperor psychically commanded the Urge to use the Netherstones, and focus her own will to dominate the brain. However, the Urge had spent the past several weeks of her adventure increasingly overindulging in her addiction. She had even admitted multiple times that she was barely in control of herself, always riding the razor's edge, sometimes slipping off. If her willpower was barely sufficient to dominate her own dark urge, what chance did she have to dominate the brain? Repeated attempts all ended the same, but when everything seemed lost and the brain was about to make its move, the Emperor pulled the Urge back and ushered them all through a portal to the astral plane, telling the Elder Brain as they vanished that this is not over. After the party made their escape, the brain willed itself higher into the sky, breaking its way through the earth and sending a signal to every single tadpoled member of the cult to initiate Ceramorphosis. And across the city they all gruesomely transformed into Mind Flayers before attacking everyone in sight. If it was chaotic in the city after the Urge had killed Gortash, it was raving bedlam now. As the citizens of Baldur's Gate hopelessly ran for their lives, they got a first glimpse of their likely new master. An absolutely gigantic, pulsating, glowing brain floating almost gently towards the upper city. Meanwhile, in the astral plane, the Emperor had come up with a new plan. His theory was that a mere person's willpower was insufficient to dominate the brain. The job required the far more advanced mental abilities possessed by mind flayers. According to the Emperor, this left them only two options. The Urge or one of her companions could evolve into a full mind flayer. She'd already been partially evolved, turned into a strange hybrid of tiefling and illithid. Would it really be that crazy to go all the way? Or she could give the Netherstones to the Emperor and let him try to dominate the brain. Remembering her recent foray into hell, as well as her penchant for gaining one's trust and then smashing it at the most inopportune time possible, the Urge came up with a third option. Use the hammer they had stolen from Raphael to free Orpheus from his imprisonment within the artifact. Somehow, despite hitchhiking in the Urge's derelict psyche for several weeks, and seeing example after example of the vile ways she operated, the Emperor still seemed surprised and even hurt by this turn of events. The Urge didn't get the chance to rub it in by killing him, however, as he vanished through a portal saying that he was defecting to the Elderbrain's team. I don't understand why he wouldn't just say, "Screw it, I tried," and portal out of the entire situation. He could go somewhere far away from the Absolute's control. Maybe it was just out of pure spite. This way he'd at least get a fair shot at revenge. Well, at least Lizelle would be happy. For a little while, anyway. Somehow the Urge's love of giving people massive trust issues for usually the last few minutes of their lives had inadvertently led to her releasing the one guy who could actually save the Gith from Blackith. She'd managed to do a very good thing, for a very bad reason. Turns out, Orpheus wasn't a huge fan of the Urge. He knew she'd wiped out an entire Githyanki creche. She'd also stolen one of his people's eggs that was subsequently used for a kind of social experiment that ended up producing a mass murderer obsessed with, but unable to fully grasp, the concepts of good and evil. The Urge had spared that one. He was kind of a kindred spirit, struggling with his own nature as the Urge had before she learned about her dark heritage. Also, the Urge thought that he could produce a pretty good bloodbath. Respect. Oh yeah, there was also the matter of killing Orpheus's entire honor guard. But to be honest, they'd attacked the Urge first. Orpheus's point on the matter was that the party should have submitted to his guards and received a quick and honorable death. Regardless of his anger with the Urge and her allies, Orpheus was pragmatic enough to recognize their need for each other. There were bigger problems, and he hated the Geik, the Gith word for mind flayers, more than any child of Bhaal. He even volunteered to be turned into a mind flayer himself, so he could use the Netherstones in an attempt to dominate the brain. Provided that the Urge kill him afterwards, because again, Githyanki really hate the Geik. And the idea of living life as one probably revolted him to his core. Githyanki society was pretty much entirely centered around driving mind flayers into extinction. This was a request the Urge had, of course, already been planning on fulfilling, so she readily agreed. So instead of the Emperor, it was Orpheus who would be entrusted with the stones. Heading into the final battle and rematch with the Brain, the Urge attended a kind of strategy meeting with the few remaining factions still strong enough to help the Urge push through the forces the Brain had activated once it had secured its freedom. All things considered, there was a surprising amount of support available to the Urge. I mean, the room was still practically empty, but the Flaming Fist and even Yurgir, Raphael's old enemy, were present. Asterion, now an ascended vampire, had a few forces of the undead to kick in. And of course the cult of Bhaal, led by the Urge herself, were all ready to roll up on some thralls. So yeah, the heroic force, rushing in to save the city, was a ragtag gang consisting of what remained of the often corrupt mercenary group that policed the lower city, a freaking devil, the undead, and a cult of assassins who worshipped the god of murder. If the Urge had her way, the city would be saved for all of 2 seconds, before finding itself with a brand new problem, the Urge herself. So she wasn't exactly looking for an army resplendent with all the forces of good and righteousness. Less possible resistance after she finally revealed to the world that she wasn't intending on defeating the Absolute. She was going to take control of it. In the end, they didn't need backup anyway. The party had become staggeringly powerful and cleaved through the Absolute's forces like they weren't even there. The final confrontation was at the top of the Elder Brain itself. The Absolute was guarded by several Mind Flayers, including the Emperor, and had even enthralled one of the Githyanki's red dragons. But even a dragon couldn't stand toe-to-toe with the Urge for long. She had become a perfect engine of violence, made in her father's image, truly the chosen of Bhaal. All of her actions leading to this point, every bit of her soul traded away piece by piece for more power, left little more than an irredeemable, hollowed-out monster, howling for blood. After the confrontation with Orin in the Temple of Bhaal, as her father demanded her submission, Shadowheart had told her that if she went through with swearing herself to Bhaal, she might as well have stayed a thrall to the Absolute. Either way, she was going to be controlled by some great evil. Shadowheart didn't know the real plan until the last minute, and by then it was far too late. She never seemed to realize the Faustian bargain she'd made. Every time she stayed and rationalized away some atrocity the party committed at the Urge's command, she was sealing the same pact the Dark Urge had. Shadowheart had been there since the beginning, keeping the Urge alive every step of the way, trading away bits of her own soul every time she ignored a red flag. She was the only party member who could have possibly changed the outcome simply by walking away. They'd all basically figured out what kind of person the Urge was by the time she ordered the attack on the Grove, yet they went along with it anyway. Will had bravely left, the rest hadn't. Alfira being randomly killed by wild animals in the night went ignored, unexamined. They had all prioritized their own goals and willingly gone along with unspeakable things if it could save their own skins. Sure, a part of it was fear. Shadowheart, more than the others, was constantly afraid of the Urge, but it was also a matter of convenience and desensitization. The longer they stayed, the more they participated, the harder it was for them to break away, and the easier it became to ignore. They had increasingly more skin in the game. Everyone had enabled the Urge's rise to power because it suited their own purposes. They were all complicit and partially responsible for what was about to transpire. Asterion and Minthara were fairly evil individuals in their own ways. Asterion in particular was, as he often assured, plotting his own rise to power. Minthara was actively egging the Urge on, whispering the sweet nothings of their plan for domination in the dead of night. Shadowheart was supposed to be a cleric of Saloon. She was supposed to have turned her back on darkness and embraced the light, yet still she had remained, enabled, rationalized. Had she ever truly converted where it mattered, in her heart? She wondered about this as she lay awake at night, manufacturing reasons not to flee. This self-doubt, most of all, was the chink in the armor of her faith that had kept her around. She knew she was a fraud, but kept telling herself her influence was needed, that she could temper the Urge, convince her to do the right thing in the end. The fact that she still believed this, entering into the final confrontation with the Elder Brain, despite everything she'd seen and experienced leading to this point, should be taken as an indication of how deep she'd fallen into her own well of self-delusion. After fighting past the last of the Absolute's defenses, including the Red Dragon and the Emperor, they were able to weaken the brain enough for Orpheus to finally take control of it with the Netherstones. They'd done it! There was one fleeting moment where everything seemed like it could end up all right. One horribly short moment where they all tasted sweet victory and relief. That was when Minthara spurred her mad lover into action. In a voice tinged with just the slightest hint of command, she said, "Now, my love, this is our chance!" and then smiled as the Urge proceeded to brutally stab Orpheus to death, while he was entirely focused on dominating the Elder Brain. As Orpheus fell and the Netherstones began spinning wildly around the Urge, before reassembling themselves over her open hand, the last precious seconds of hope passed, and the horror began to spread. It all happened fast after that. As Minthara and Asterion nodded and smiled approvingly, Shadowheart finally figured out what the endgame had been all along. As the horror of realization spread through her brain and down her spine, the weeks of lies she told herself all suddenly collapsed. If she knew that she only had time to say a single thing, she probably would have chosen her words more carefully. "What are you doing? Stop!" The urge looked at her evenly, and Shadowheart felt like she was seeing her leader for the first time. "Don't worry. You're still a part of my design." The Elder Brain, who had previously been begging for its life in droning sentence fragments, began to mutter the words, "Together, conquer, kill, slaughter." The urge had firmly established her control, and the brain now spoke the word of Bhaal. It was an eerie glimpse into the mind that now utterly controlled it. The dark urge's terrifying inner landscape leaking out into reality. As soon as control was established, the urge sent a pulse through the cobweb of psychic ties, binding everyone on the Sword Coast the cult had tadpoled. This transmitted to them the urge's will, now indistinguishable from the will of Bhaal. Simultaneously, they turned and headed to the brain. New orders had been received. Shadowheart turned with them, now staring with admiration at the urge, her eyes now glowing with an unquenchable desire to enact the will of the god of murder. The companions had been rewarded for their service by being given the opportunity to live and continue to serve the urge and her father by taking leading roles in the coming cull. Their memories, personalities, and goals all dropped away into a newly opened abyss. They were now merely the extra appendages of their brutal leader. This fate was particularly cruel where Minthara was concerned. She had believed that the urge and herself would rule together, side by side as equals. Instead, the urge had freed her from the Absolute's control, only to later enthrall her herself. Minthara only got to be herself for a matter of weeks. Her last genuine words to the urge, directly before her supposed love took control, were, "You've never been more beautiful." The story ends as the urge moves towards her new throne, perched atop the Elder Brain. Githyanki red dragons falling from the sky around her. Mind Flayer ships warping in and taking formation around the brain, preparing to sweep through the land with one purpose. Deaths in droves. She seats herself, wearing the smile of a yawning mass grave. In the name of Bhaal. Apparently a new patch was released that adds an actual epilogue to the end of the game. I have no interest in checking it out. For my Dark Urge playthrough, the ending I got was perfect. I like to think the Dark Urge Bhaal ending will be canon, and the DLC or next game will have the Dark Urge as its primary antagonist. Kinda like she was in this one. This was the best evil playthrough of a game I've ever had, and yes, I played Tyranny. Filling in the blanks of the story as well as the inner life, or lack thereof, for my character was a lot of fun, even though it made me feel dirty a few times. If you just go into it like any other playthrough, it might not have the same effect. I think the Dark Urge playthrough shines when you actually roleplay the character. How could anyone justify doing the things an unchecked Dark Urge does? It's a lot easier when your character is nearly a blank slate, with the only initial mark being an inexplicable urge to end the lives of others. This is particularly effective before the character finds out the truth of themselves, that they are not only Bhaal spawn, but the cause of the entire conflict. You don't have a real motivation for the things you do, so the instinct is to construct one, and this can lead to a lot of scary yet interesting places. As the urge, you are the antagonist in Baldur's Gate 3. Even if you decide to fight the urge and fix the damage your past self caused, you're still the reason everything that happens. You still have an ocean of blood on your hands. Everything the cult of the Absolute did wouldn't have happened if you didn't come up with the initial idea and put it into action. The mind of someone like the urge is terrifying. Only the worst people who've ever existed perpetrated their dark deeds without any motive besides the pleasure they got from causing harm. This is a game that lets you play as someone like Henry Lee Lucas, Ted Bundy, or John Wayne Gacy. The worst of the worst when it comes to sadistic killers. People who make Dahmer seem like a nice guy who just wanted to be loved. The other side of this coin is that this makes the Urge a pretty one-note character if you don't try to redeem them. However, from a horror standpoint, there are few things scarier than a completely irrational killer that cares for nothing but blood. Once you understand why a person does what they do, they become less terrifying. You can start to empathize with them. There's simply none of that to be had when dealing with the Dark Urge. Rarely does a game let you be a Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers style killing machine, if you so choose. For that, if for no other reason, I had a great time. I've always loved games that let you play as the monster, but most of those games lack any kind of depth. Your victims are usually just paper dolls with no real purpose or personality, outside of existing to become another notch on the handle of the killer's weapon. Especially when experienced as a second playthrough, the Dark Urge neatly circumvents this. You've probably had 100 hours to get to know and become attached to this huge cast of characters, only to brutalize or subjugate them when you play again as the Dark Urge. It's hugely telling that there were characters that I completely avoided simply because I couldn't stand the idea of hurting them. The context of your past 100 hours can add a massive weight to your decisions that pretty much any other RPG seems to unfortunately shy away from. I've never seen a game where you spend that much time growing attached to its world and characters, only for the designers to hand you a knife and a can of gasoline 100 hours later and say, well, get to work. Most people roleplay by having some sort of connection to the character they play, something in common, or even an aspirational element. So how would a sane individual find any kind of common ground with the Urge? Any similarity at all that would provide a jumping off point? I repeatedly made allusions to the Urge being similar to an addict throughout this video. I did this because I was a real bad alcoholic for about a decade. I remember what it was like to know what you're doing is bad, but do it anyway, in order to quiet, no matter how temporarily, a dark urge. I had to go back to one of the worst periods of my life in order to glimpse what was happening inside of this character's vandalized mind. This is a person that knows hurting people is wrong, and that she's evil for doing it anyway. But at the end of the day, your life just isn't as important to her as feeding that abyss of need, filling that bottomless pit inside of her. I can't imagine many things more terrifying than someone who thinks like that. Instead of a junkie holding you up for the contents of your wallet so he can get his next fix, she's an addict that's more interested in the contents of your stomach. And that is her fix. There is nothing but your life that you can provide her. No way to help her, but be one more in a never-ending series of deaths. You'll die for her, without knowing that even the greatest sacrifice she could possibly make means nothing to her. She'll forget everything about you the moment the urge bares its fangs once again, demanding more, ever more. Feed me. This was never intended to be an in-depth story analysis. It's specifically about the Dark Urge, or at least who my version of them ended up being, how I pictured them, how I played as them. I left a bunch of parts out because, well, have you seen the runtime on this thing? It's also about how dark the world of D&D can be, how a plan hatched by a doomed god can worm its way through time and change the course of history, maybe even signal the end of everything. In the world of D&D, the urge isn't even that special. There are entire civilizations whose only goal is to dominate everyone that isn't them. Entire generations raised to believe they are superior and entitled to all of the power. Everyone else lives only to serve their dark designs. There's a few examples of this in BG3. The Mind Flayers, the Drow. Only, usually in D&D, the player's goal is to stop them and their evil plans. Even when playing an evil character, the goal is usually just power, domination, subjugation of those considered lesser. Only here is the goal reduced to such frightening, terrible simplicity. Deaths. Deaths in droves. If you've made it this far, you're amazing. You should continue to be amazing by subscribing to the channel, or liking the video, or commenting. My real dark urge is for that sweet, sweet algo juice. We're going to switch things up a bit. I'm going to do 3 much shorter videos in a month. The longer form videos will return after that, unless the short form videos do really well or something. I'm doing this in order to fulfill one of YouTube's monetization requirements. I haven't 100% decided yet, but I think these videos are going to be about some of Stephen King's short stories, or maybe some of his lesser known monsters like Mr. Munchin from the Black House. I haven't been able to decide as of this writing, but they will not be video game related. I've also been wanting to talk about a Canadian independent film from 1989 named Things for a long time now. If you have an idea for a shorter form video you might like to see, put it in the comments. Maybe I'll do it. I'll at least put it on the list. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'll see you again real soon. Karlak is Bay, and have a nice day. I'm sorry about that. See ya!